Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I wasn't supposed to get lost. I had come to see the castle, not to wander through its endless corridors like some kind of fool. But it happened. I found myself alone in the labyrinth, the walls seeming to shift and close in with every turn I made. I tried to convince myself it was all part of the charm, the mystery of the place, but something deep inside me knew this wasn't right. At first, it was just a passing thought. A strange feeling that something was watching me, lingering at the edge of my awareness. It was as if the very air had thickened, pressing against me with a weight I couldn't explain. I brushed it off, though. After all, I was just in a maze, right? There was nothing supernatural about it. But then I heard it. A faint sound, like the whisper of fabric brushing against stone. My heart skipped and I froze. I was certain I was alone. The guy had left me behind and the others had long since gone ahead. The silence around me was suffocating, but the noise was something else. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head, trying to calm my nerves. It must have been the wind. It was a drafty old castle, after all. I took a few more steps, but that's when I noticed it. The shadows. They weren't quite right. I had walked down this path just moments ago, and it had been empty, well lit by the weak glow of the torch on the wall. But now, as I passed the same spot again, I saw them, shadows moving when they shouldn't be. I stopped again, heart racing. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was the dim lighting playing tricks on my eyes. But no, it wasn't just that. There was something else, something I couldn't quite grasp. The path ahead seemed endless, the walls of the labyrinth closing in tighter with every step. I turned around, but the way I came had disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. I couldn't see the exit. The maze had swallowed me whole. I kept walking. I had no choice. The labyrinth was an endless maze of sharp turns, high walls, and narrowing pathways. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of old stone and dust. The light from the torches flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, making the whole place feel alive. Alive, or maybe something worse. The deeper I went, the more I noticed the details. The walls felt like they were closing in, inch by inch. Every corner I turned seemed to look exactly the same as the last. The passageways twisted and turned, looping back on themselves. How could I be so lost in a place I'd only just entered? My thoughts were interrupted by another sound, faint but distinct. It wasn't the wind this time. It was the sound of footsteps. I froze, the blood draining from my face. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was behind me. The footsteps were light, but they were there, getting closer with every passing second. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just empty space. I listened carefully, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped. Maybe it was just the echo of my own steps, I told myself. I forced my legs to move, tried to convince myself that I was being irrational. The labyrinth was old, and everything in it creaked, groaned, and shifted. But even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my breath coming in shallow bursts. As I continued down another narrow corridor, something strange happened. The air grew colder. The warmth from the torches seemed to evaporate, leaving behind an icy chill that settled into my bones. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to ward off the cold, but it didn't help. The deeper I went, the colder it became. Suddenly, I heard it again. A soft whisper, too quiet to understand, but unmistakably there. It seemed to be coming from just around the corner, from the dark void that stretched ahead. I stood still for a moment, staring into the shadows. Should I turn back? Should I run? My thoughts were spinning, each one more panicked than the last. But when I looked behind me, the way I had come had disappeared. The passage was gone, replaced by a solid stone wall. I was trapped. The whisper came again, closer now. I couldn't understand the words, but it felt like something, was speaking directly into my ear. My heart pounded faster, and my breath hitched in my throat. I was shaking, my body refusing to move. A figure appeared in the darkness, just beyond the edge of the torchlight. It was tall, its shape shifting in the shadows. It didn't make a sound as it moved, but I could feel its presence. Something cold and malicious. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. It was like the air had turned to stone, choking me. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming clearer. It was humanoid, but not quite. Its features were twisted, like someone had stretched the skin and molded it into something unnatural. I had to get away. I couldn't just stand there. But my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, by the overwhelming sense that I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape. Then, the figure reached out. It moved faster than I could comprehend, its hands coming for me. I stumbled back, panic flooding my veins, and without thinking, I turned and ran. But the labyrinth was relentless. The walls seemed to shift and stretch before me, leading me in circles. Every path I took, every turn I made, only brought me back to the same place. The figure was still there, always just behind me, its whisper growing louder, more insistent. I was going to lose my mind in this maze. I could feel it. I wasn't just lost anymore. I was being hunted. I ran. My legs burned, my chest heaved with each breath, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let that thing catch me. My mind screamed for me to turn back, to find the way out, but the walls seemed to mock me. No matter which direction I went, the maze stretched endlessly, a twisted mockery of escape. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, no longer just a faint echo, but real, solid, as if the thing was right there, right on my heels. I dared a quick glance over my shoulder. It was there, closer now, its long limbs bending unnaturally as it moved, its eyes glowing in the dark like burning embers. I choked on the air, stumbling forward. Every step I took felt like I was sinking into quicksand. The labyrinth was alive, pushing me, pulling me deeper into its heart. I could feel the walls closing in, the very stones beneath my feet beginning to shift, as if the maze was alive and conscious of my every move. It wanted me. No, it needed me. The whispering grew louder. It was no longer a voice, but a chorus of sounds, groans, whispers, and the occasional, sharp, unintelligible shriek. The noises swirled around me, making it impossible to focus. They were coming from all directions, surrounding me, wrapping me in a suffocating web of sound. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but the noise was inside my head now, clawing at my sanity. My thoughts were fraying at the edges. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Was the figure behind me? Was it still there, or was I just imagining it? I turned another corner and stumbled into a wide chamber. The walls stretched high above, shrouded in shadows, but there were no lights, no torches. The darkness was thick, like something tangible, suffocating. I leaned against the cold stone, gasping for air. My eyes darted around, searching for some clue, some way out, but the chamber felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I tried to steady myself. And then I saw it. A shape just at the edge of the darkness. It wasn't the figure from before. This was different. It was tall, far taller than any human should be, and its limbs were long and thin, stretching unnaturally toward the ceiling. It was bent at a strange angle, its body twisted, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. I took a step back, but the labyrinth had shifted again. The exit was gone. The walls had closed in around me, trapping me in this strange chamber with this thing, whatever it was. The figure moved toward me, its limbs jerking with a sickening crack. I could hear its bones snapping, but it didn't seem to care. The sound of it was enough to make me want to vomit. But I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, my body locked in place by sheer terror. It was close now. I could feel the coldness radiating from it, the air around it growing colder still. It was no longer just an outline in the dark. I could see the details now. Its face, or what was left of it, was contorted in a grotesque grin. Its mouth was too wide, the skin stretched thin over sharp, jagged teeth. Its eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull everything into them. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It was a twisted, guttural growl, a sound that came from deep within the earth itself. "You cannot escape," it rasped. "You belong to the maze now." I wanted to scream, but the words were stuck in my throat. My vision blurred, my thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. The walls seemed to breathe, shifting and warping, and the very air around me felt suffocating. I had no choice. I had to fight. I had to get out. I turned and ran again, but this time the maze didn't let me go. The walls seemed to press in on me, the path narrowing with every step. The creature's footsteps echoed in the distance, chasing me, always just behind. I could feel its presence, feel it breathing down my neck, but I couldn't turn around. I couldn't stop. I ran blindly, every turn I took leading me deeper into the heart of the labyrinth. The walls whispered, the shadows shifted, and the creature's voice called to me, low and mocking, "You cannot escape." I stumbled, falling to my knees in exhaustion, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The maze was alive, and it was never going to let me out. I kept running, but it felt useless. My body ached, my head spun, and the labyrinth seemed to mock me. The walls twisted and warped in ways I couldn't understand. Every turn, every passage, led me further into the heart of the maze, further away from any hope of escape. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. The creature had stopped chasing me, or perhaps it was just toying with me, waiting for the right moment to strike. But the silence that followed was worse than the pursuit. It felt like the air itself had become thick, pressing in on me from all sides. I had no idea where I was anymore. The once familiar torches had gone out, leaving the labyrinth in complete darkness. I couldn't even see my hands in front of my face, and every step I took felt like I was sinking into something deeper, darker. The cold from earlier had returned, but now it was more than just physical. It was in my bones, in my mind. I stopped for a moment, trying to steady myself. I needed to think. What was happening to me? Was any of this real? Was I losing my mind? The thought made me laugh bitterly. Losing my mind? I had already lost it the moment I stepped into this cursed labyrinth. Then, out of nowhere, the whisper came again. It was faint at first, just like before, but now it was sharper, more distinct. Turn around, it said, a voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. I froze. The air seemed to freeze with me, as though time itself had stopped. I couldn't breathe. My heart slammed in my chest, threatening to break through my ribs. The voice was in my head. It wasn't coming from behind me, or from the walls, or from anywhere I could see. It was inside me, twisting my thoughts, pulling me closer to the darkness. Turn around, the voice repeated, this time more insistent, its tone a cold caress that chilled me to the core. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the cold stone floor, my body paralyzed. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to face whatever was behind me, but I didn't want to. The fear was too overwhelming. The silence stretched on, suffocating me. It was as though the entire labyrinth was holding its breath, waiting. And then, with a suddenness that made me gasp, something shifted. The walls around me seemed to bend, to breathe. They inched closer, narrowing the space around me until I could barely move. My chest tightened, and I felt as though the very stone was pressing in on me, trying to crush the life out of me. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't the creature. No, this was different. It was human, or at least it looked that way. But the figure was wrong in so many ways. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body stretched in unnatural proportions. Its limbs were too long, the fingers tapering into sharp, claw-like points. Its face was obscured by a mask, but I could see the eyes, empty, hollow voids that seemed to draw everything into them. They were black, so black that they swallowed the light, creating an abyss in the middle of its face. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The fear was choking me, suffocating me. And yet, I felt a pull toward it, as if something deep inside me was drawn to this creature. Something dark, something that called me forward. The figure stepped forward, its long, slender limbs gliding with an eerie smoothness. It didn't make a sound as it moved, but I could feel its presence, feel the coldness that radiated from it, seeping into my skin. Come closer, the voice inside my head said, but now it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. A pull that I couldn't resist. I took a step forward, despite every ounce of my being screaming at me to stop. The walls seemed to part as I moved, the space around me growing colder, darker, as though the very air was holding its breath. The figure was waiting for me, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. The closer I got, the more I could see the cracks in its skin, the strange texture that didn't resemble flesh, but something else, something wrong. And yet, I couldn't stop. My body moved of its own accord, as if it were no longer mine. Join me, the figure said, its voice a low, gravelly growl that seemed to resonate in my very bones. I reached out a trembling hand, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. But just as my fingers brushed the cold surface of its outstretched hand, something inside me snapped. I pulled away, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body shaking with fear and disbelief. I was not going to let it have me. Not like this. I turned and ran, faster than I ever thought possible, my feet pounding against the stone floor. But the walls weren't just shifting anymore, they were alive, closing in on me. The passageways blurred, the air pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I could feel the creature behind me, its cold presence following me, always just a step away. It was hunting me. And I knew, deep in my gut, that I was running out of time. I was running on pure instinct now. My mind, a blur of terror and confusion, barely registered the world around me. The labyrinth, no, the living nightmare that had swallowed me whole, was closing in. The walls, the air, the very ground beneath me, it all shifted, pulsating, twisting in ways that defied logic. The maze was a creature in itself, and I was its prey. I turned another corner, the stone slicked beneath my shoes, my breath coming in shallow, frantic bursts. Behind me, the footsteps resumed, slow at first, but relentless. The sound echoed off the walls, surrounding me, pushing me further into madness. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. If I did, I was certain it would be there, its hollow eyes staring into mine, dragging me into the depths of its world. I reached a dead end. The passage, once endless, now abruptly stopped, a solid stone wall blocking my way. Panic rose like bile in my throat, and for a moment, I simply stood there, staring at the wall as though willing it to open. But nothing happened. The wall was cold, lifeless, impenetrable. I spun around, desperate, but there was no way forward. No escape. It was as if the maze itself had chosen this moment to trap me, to hold me in its grasp. I could feel the creature getting closer, its presence like a shadow, its cold breath creeping down my spine. And then I heard the whisper again. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real. It was coming from behind me, from the walls themselves, as if the very stones were alive. I turned, trembling, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The figure stood there, just outside the reach of the dim light. It had always been there, hadn't it? Watching, waiting, just out of sight. The figure stepped forward, and this time I could see its face clearly. It wasn't a mask. No, it was the skin itself, stretched thin and distorted, like something had been carved out of it. The eyes, those hollow, empty pits, stared at me with a hunger that sent a jolt of ice through my veins. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, too many to count, each one glinting in the dim light. "Join me," it rasped, its voice like a rusted nail scraping across stone. The words slithered into my mind, pulling at the very fabric of my thoughts. You belong to the maze. You belong to me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The creature was close, too close now. I could feel it reaching for me, pulling me into its world. Its fingers twitched, like they were waiting for me to make the final move. To give in. But I didn't. I didn't know how I found the strength, but something inside me snapped. The terror, the desperation, everything I had been holding back, it exploded. With a scream, I turned and slammed my fists against the wall in front of me. And it gave way. The stone cracked like glass, splintering into jagged pieces, revealing a hidden passage behind it. I didn't question it. I didn't hesitate. I dove into the hole, crawling through the darkness, feeling the cold stone scrape against my skin, pushing forward as fast as I could. I could hear the creature behind me, its laughter, twisted and high-pitched, echoing through the maze. It was close. I crawled, my heart thundering in my chest, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I emerged into another chamber. But this one was different. It wasn't part of the maze. The walls were smooth, too smooth, and the air dry, sterile. It was an empty room, a hollow place, devoid of life. I stood, my legs shaking, and looked around. There were no windows, no doors, just walls that stretched up into the darkness. And then I saw it. In the center of the room was a small pedestal. On it, a broken object. A ring. It was the same one I had seen earlier, the one I had thrown away in the forest. The one that had once belonged to me. The one that had disappeared, only to reappear here, in the heart of the labyrinth. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. The moment I touched it, the room shifted. The walls began to close in on me, the floor beneath my feet cracked open, revealing a vast chasm that stretched out into nothingness. A voice, familiar, yet not, whispered from the shadows, wrapping itself around my mind like a vice. "It's too late," it said, the words dripping with venom. "You were never meant to escape." The walls were closing faster now, and I realized with a sickening clarity this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning. The labyrinth had never been a place. It had always been inside me. There's something about still water that makes you feel as if you're looking into the past. Have you ever noticed that? The way it doesn't just show you what's in front of it, but something deeper, something hidden? It was a question that I never really thought about until I found myself standing by that lake, staring into its glassy surface, waiting for something to break the silence. I had come to this place alone, as I often did when I wanted to clear my head. The woods around the lake were thick with trees, their branches tangled like old memories, twisting in ways that seemed unnatural. There was a strange quietness in the air, as though the world had forgotten to breathe. It felt oppressive, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. I didn't expect to see anything out of the ordinary. The lake was just a lake, a forgotten spot in a forgotten part of the world. But as I walked closer, the air around me began to change. The familiar rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds faded away, replaced by a heavy silence. I could almost hear my own heartbeat in the stillness, a rhythmic thump that seemed too loud for the world I had entered. I stopped at the edge of the water, the reflection of the trees and sky staring back at me with a perfect stillness. But as I leaned closer, something felt off. I don't know how to explain it. It was like the reflection was wrong, as if the water wasn't just showing the present, but something else. Something buried. For a moment, I thought I saw figures standing behind me in the water. A faint outline, a shadow that wasn't quite mine. But when I spun around, there was nothing but the empty shore and the quiet, distant trees. I turned back to the water, feeling a chill run down my spine. The figure was gone, but the reflection, it shifted. The surface rippled slightly, distorting the image of the trees, the sky, my own face. The changes were subtle at first, like flickers in the corner of my vision. But as I stared harder, I began to see it more clearly. Faces. Ghostly, fleeting images, just beyond the surface. They were there, and then gone in an instant, like whispers fading into the air. I blinked and stepped back. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the sun was getting to me. But something in the pit of my stomach told me that wasn't it. It wasn't just the reflection that was wrong. It was the whole feeling of the place, as if the lake itself was pulling me in, showing me things I wasn't supposed to see. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but the air seemed colder now. The trees around me, once so still, were starting to creak and sway, their branches groaning under some invisible pressure. I felt a strange weight in the atmosphere, as if something was watching, waiting for me to make a move. I didn't want to look back at the water, but I did. And this time, when I looked into the reflection, it wasn't just the trees or the sky or my own face staring back at me. There was someone standing just behind me in the water. A figure I couldn't quite make out, like a blur of movement just at the edge of my vision. I froze. My pulse quickened, and my mind screamed at me to turn around, to run. But I couldn't. The reflection in the water was pulling me in, drawing me closer, like a magnet. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice breaking the silence. There was no answer, just the sound of my own breath, ragged and uneven. I took another step closer, my eyes glued to the water. The figure was clearer now, more defined. It was tall, cloaked in shadows, its face hidden. But the outline, it was unmistakable. It was my reflection. Only it wasn't me. The figure in the water was me, and yet it wasn't. I stepped back, stumbling, my heart racing. I didn't know what I was seeing or why it was happening, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure was still there, its hand raised, just inches away from my own reflection. And then the water rippled again. The surface blurred, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something else, something darker. Something not human. I had to leave. I didn't know why, but the pull of the lake was too strong. It was like the reflection had a hold on me, digging into my soul, pulling me into a place I wasn't supposed to be. I turned away from the water, running towards the trees, towards the path I had come from. But the air felt thicker now, pressing on me. And the further I ran, the more I felt the sensation of eyes on me, watching, waiting. It wasn't just a reflection in the lake anymore. It was everywhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Something had been waiting for me, hidden beneath the surface, in the shadows of the trees. And the lake, it wasn't done with me yet. I knew that, deep down. I had only seen the beginning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The further I walked away from the lake, the heavier the air seemed to become, as if the very atmosphere had been corrupted by what I had seen. The woods around me had once felt like a place of solace, but now they felt like a maze, the trees too close, their branches creaking unnervingly, like they were whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, that I was imagining things, but the feeling of being followed was undeniable. My footsteps quickened, my mind racing through a dozen explanations that all seemed to end at one conclusion: I wasn't alone. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from the lake standing just behind me, watching me from the shadows. But there was nothing there, just the same old trees, the same quiet path winding its way through the forest. Still, something lingered in the back of my mind. The reflection hadn't been just a trick of the light or a momentary lapse in my sanity. It had been real. The figure in the water, the feeling of being drawn toward it, it had all been too vivid, too present to ignore. I tried to calm myself, to focus on putting distance between me and that lake. But the woods seemed endless. The path, which had been so clear just an hour ago, now twisted and turned in ways I didn't remember. Every turn felt wrong, like the landscape was rearranging itself, folding in on me, closing me in. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, the air growing colder as the sun dipped lower behind the trees. I knew I had to keep moving, had to get out of the woods before it got too dark, but every step felt heavier than the last, as if something was pressing down on me. And then I heard it. A faint sound at first, like a soft whisper carried by the wind. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to listen. There it was again. A voice. It wasn't clear, but it was there. Low, distant, almost like a hum beneath the wind. I looked around, my eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for the source. But there was nothing. No one. I shook my head, trying to push away the panic creeping up on me. It was just the wind. It had to be. I kept walking, faster now, my footsteps quickening as the whispers grew louder. They were no longer just in the air, now they were in my head, twisting through my thoughts like vines. They sounded almost like names. My name, for sure, but other names, too, names I didn't recognize, names I couldn't place. I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the forest blurred around me. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the path like dark fingers reaching for me. The whispers seemed to follow, growing more insistent, more frantic. I could almost feel the weight of eyes on me, as though the very trees were watching, waiting for me to stumble. And then, just as I was starting to think I would never find my way out of the woods, I saw it. The clearing. The familiar clearing where I had entered the forest, where the lake had been. I stumbled toward it, my heart pounding, relief flooding my chest. But as I crossed into the clearing, my breath caught in my throat. The lake was no longer where I had left it. It had changed. The water was still, unnaturally so, like a sheet of glass. But the reflection, no, it wasn't a reflection anymore. It was something else. Something darker, more distorted. I took a step forward, drawn to it despite myself. The surface shimmered, rippling in the same way it had before, but this time it wasn't just faces that appeared. There were shapes. Dark, shifting silhouettes that moved in and out of the water as though they were trying to escape its depths. I took another step, my feet moving on their own, the urge to look closer overwhelming. The whispering voices were louder now, echoing in my mind, calling me closer. The figure in the water, the one I had seen earlier, reappeared. But this time, it wasn't just behind me in the reflection. It was standing in front of me, right there, in the water, its form shifting and warping, its face still hidden beneath shadows. "Who are you?" I whispered, the words slipping from my lips before I could stop them. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand, just like before, reaching out toward me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The voices were louder now, screaming at me, urging me to stay, to come closer. But I couldn't. I couldn't let it pull me in again. I turned to run, but as I did, I heard something else. A sound. A thud. Like footsteps. I froze. The sound wasn't coming from the lake this time. It was coming from behind me, coming closer. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the lake. Just the shadows. But the whispers, they were growing louder, more frantic. And I realized with a cold shock that they weren't just voices. They were words, words that seemed to come from everywhere, from inside my own mind. "Stay with us," they whispered. "You belong here." I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. The figure in the water was still there, waiting, its outstretched hand trembling with anticipation. I had to move. I had to escape. But as I turned to run, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, closer now, too close. Someone, or something, was behind me. I didn't wait for the footsteps to grow louder. Panic surged through me, propelling me forward, my legs moving faster than I had ever thought possible. My chest was tight, air coming in short, shallow bursts. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, but all I could hear now was the thudding of my own footsteps and the rustling of the trees around me. The whispers, those haunting, insistent whispers, seemed to fade into the background, but I knew they were still there, lurking just beneath the surface of my mind. They were watching. I had to get away. I couldn't stay here, not with that thing in the water, not with whatever was following me. My eyes darted between the trees, searching for some escape, but all I saw were the endless rows of dark trunks, stretching on like a never-ending maze. The clearing where the lake had been, the lake that had somehow transformed into something darker, something alive, was fading behind me, but the image of the figure's outstretched hand was seared into my mind. Suddenly, the footsteps behind me grew louder. Closer. I didn't dare turn around. I knew if I looked, if I confirmed what was following me, I would lose what little control I had left. I could feel the presence behind me, like a shadow that stretched and writhed just beyond my vision. The air felt thick, and the ground beneath my feet was soft, making each step harder to take. My breath hitched in my throat as I stumbled over a tree root, nearly falling. I righted myself, but I didn't slow down. The woods had never seemed so dark, so suffocating. The trees seemed to close in on me, their branches twisting and creaking, and I could have sworn I saw something move among them, dark shapes that slithered just out of sight. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but the words were lodged in my throat. Who would hear me? The trees? The shadows? I couldn't let it catch me. I couldn't let whatever was out there touch me. But just as the panic began to swell in my chest, I saw it. A break in the trees, a sliver of light cutting through the dark, just ahead. I could escape. I could get to the edge of the forest, to the open road, to safety. My pulse surged with hope, and I pushed myself harder, my legs aching as I sprinted toward the light. And then, just as I reached the clearing, I heard the unmistakable sound of a voice. Don't leave. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was soft, like a breath against the back of my neck, but it was clear enough. It was a command, not a plea. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to see the figure standing behind me. I could feel its presence, like a weight in the air. But I could also feel something else, a pull, like a thread winding around my body, drawing me back toward the forest, toward the lake. I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped between the path I had tried to escape and the invisible force that was holding me here. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but the words wouldn't come. The pull was too strong. The ground beneath me felt like it was shifting, like the earth itself was trying to swallow me whole. Then I heard it. A whisper, softer than the first, but clearer, more insistent. Stay with us. It wasn't just one voice this time. There were many. Male and female, old and young, all speaking in perfect unison. The sound of it was like a song, a lullaby, soothing and terrifying at once. And all of them were telling me the same thing, to stay. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the voices, but when I opened them again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure in the water, it was no longer a reflection. It was standing on the shore. Its face was shrouded in darkness, but I could make out the faintest outline of its features, twisted and distorted. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, reaching down to the water's surface. Its hand, now fully visible, was extended toward me, beckoning me as if it had been waiting for me to return. I took a step back, my heart racing. The thing in the water didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, their voices pushing against my mind. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. And then, the air shifted again. The water began to ripple, slowly at first, but with increasing speed until it churned violently, as though something beneath it was stirring. I didn't dare get closer, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Something was coming. Something from the depths of the water. The figure's hand trembled, its fingers twitching with anticipation. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice like sandpaper scraping against my mind. I knew what it wanted. It wanted me. It wanted to pull me back into the depths with it. But I wasn't ready to give in. I couldn't let it take me. I turned, my legs moving before my brain could process what I was doing. My feet hit the ground hard as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees blurred around me, and the clearing, along with the lake, was left behind. But even as I ran, I could still hear the whispers, still feel that pull deep inside me, a magnetic force dragging me back toward the lake. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I had no idea what I was running from. I only knew one thing. I couldn't stop running. I didn't stop running. My legs burned with each step, but I couldn't slow down, couldn't allow myself to pause for even a second. The sound of my own breath, quick and desperate, was the only thing I could hear above the pounding of my heart. But somewhere, hidden beneath the frantic rush of blood and breath, was that voice again, soft but unmistakable, "Don't leave." I stumbled, tripping over a twisted root, but I caught myself just in time, pushing forward through the dense underbrush. The air around me felt thick and heavy, suffocating with every breath I drew. And yet, even as I fought to escape, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that wasn't just my imagination. The shadows in the trees seemed to stretch longer than they should, their dark fingers brushing against my skin as I passed. They reached for me, pulling at me, urging me to look back. But I couldn't. If I did, I knew I would never get away. I didn't know how long I ran, minutes, hours. Time had lost all meaning. I only knew that the further I went, the closer the whispers seemed to get. They followed me like a swarm of insects, crawling beneath my skin, gnawing at my sanity. The air, once so fresh and crisp, now smelled of rot and decay, like something ancient and forgotten had awoken from a long, dark slumber. Finally, I broke free of the forest, stumbling into the open field that bordered the lake. The sight of it made my heart seize in my chest, as though it recognized something my mind had refused to acknowledge. I had been running toward the lake all along. The clearing where I had first seen the figure in the water was only a few steps away. I stopped, frozen in place. The lake lay before me, its surface now calm, as though nothing had ever disturbed it. But I knew better. I could feel the pull, the subtle, unrelenting force that dragged at my very soul, beckoning me toward its depths. The whispers were louder now, not just a voice here and there, but a chorus of them all calling my name. My knees buckled beneath me, and I collapsed onto the damp earth, my hands shaking as they pressed against the cool grass. "Come closer." The voice was unmistakable. It was the same one I had heard in the woods, the one that had followed me, urging me to stay, to return. I couldn't bring myself to look into the water. I knew what I would see, the reflection of something that wasn't me, something that had no place in the world I knew. And yet, even as my mind screamed at me to turn away, I felt the weight of something in my chest, something heavy and dark, pulling me in. I stood up slowly, my limbs moving as if they belonged to someone else. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to escape this place, but my feet carried me forward, step by step, toward the lake. The surface rippled in response, the water shivering like it recognized my approach. I could see the faintest movement beneath the glassy surface, something shifting, something reaching for me. I froze as the reflection of my face twisted, contorting into something unrecognizable. It wasn't my face anymore. No, the figure in the water wore my face, but it was wrong. Its eyes were hollow, sunken, and the skin stretched too tight, like it had been pulled over the skull by invisible hands. Its lips twitched in a twisted, mocking smile, but it wasn't me. It couldn't be. "Stay with us," it whispered, the words vibrating in the air like a distant drumbeat, sending a wave of nausea through my stomach. I recoiled, but the reflection didn't move. It stayed there, trapped within the water, as if it was waiting for me to cross some invisible boundary. A part of me wanted to scream, to run as fast as I could, but I stood rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from the mirror image that wasn't mine. The thing in the water was a reflection of something I had never known, something I had never been. And yet, it felt like it knew me, like it had always been a part of me. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow and ragged, but the whispers followed me, their voices surrounding me, drowning out everything else. "Don't go. You belong here. We are waiting for you." My legs felt like lead as I turned, stumbling away from the water, but I couldn't escape. The pull, the weight of it, pressed against my chest, like 1,000 invisible hands wrapped around my heart, squeezing it with growing intensity. I could feel the darkness closing in, feel it pressing against the edges of my mind. Every step I took felt heavier, the ground beneath me sinking, softening like quicksand. The whispers, now a cacophony, filled the air, relentless, deafening. And then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A voice, clear and sharp, cutting through the others like a knife. "You are not alone." I turned, my eyes wide, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing. No one. Only the lake, dark and still, and the trees that surrounded me like silent sentinels. I had to leave. I had to get away. But when I turned to run, the world shifted. The ground beneath me tilted, and the trees seemed to bend and warp, their trunks twisting like grotesque figures. The sky above me, once clear and open, was now a dark, oppressive blanket of clouds, suffocating the light. And through it all, the whispers, the voices, continued, now joined by a new sound, soft, wet footsteps. I wasn't alone. And I realized, with a sickening twist in my stomach, that I had never been alone. I wasn't running anymore. I was being followed. Something was coming for me. Something I could no longer escape. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in the shadow of the lake, caught between the crushing weight of the whispers and the haunting vision of that thing in the water. My body felt numb, as though the air itself was pushing against me, holding me in place. But I couldn't stay. Not here. Not with whatever was following me, growing ever closer. I turned, my feet barely finding purchase on the shifting ground beneath me. The path I had taken to the lake had disappeared, swallowed by the dark, writhing undergrowth. The trees around me twisted, their branches reaching out like fingers eager to snare me, to pull me back into the depths of whatever dark force had claimed this place. A sound, a low, grating hiss, broke through the whispers, cutting through the fog that clouded my thoughts. I spun, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes scanned the trees, the shadows, but saw nothing. And yet, I could feel it. The presence. Close. Something was there. Watching. Waiting. I had to keep moving. I didn't care where. I didn't care if I was running in circles. I just needed to escape. What if the silence wasn't empty? What if it was waiting? I had always thought of myself as a rational man. I believed in what I could see, touch, and understand. But one night, as I walked home through the empty streets, something changed. It wasn't loud or even immediately noticeable. It started with a whisper, a sound so faint I could have sworn it was just the wind. But it wasn't. The night was thick with fog, the kind that seemed to absorb every sound, every movement. The streetlights cast long, dim shadows that stretched like fingers, and my footsteps were the only thing that broke the eerie quiet. I pulled my jacket tighter, not from the cold, but because a strange unease was creeping up on me. Something was watching. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the darkness playing tricks. But then it came again, soft, almost like a breath, but clearer. It was a voice, just at the edge of hearing, too quiet to be certain, but distinct enough to send a chill down my spine. I stopped. I stood still in the middle of the road, listening. The fog pressed in around me, thickening the air, suffocating any other noise. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. The voice came again, louder this time, though still just a murmur. It was impossible to make out the words, but the sound, it was familiar. It was almost as if it was calling my name. But I didn't recognize it. My heart started to race. My instinct screamed for me to turn around, to run. But my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to take a single step. The air around me seemed heavier, as though it was pulling at me, forcing me to stay. I heard a rustle behind me, the sound of leaves moving in the still night air. It shouldn't have been there. There was nothing in the street. No one walking. No cars. But I turned slowly, hoping it was just my imagination playing tricks. Nothing. The street was empty. The fog curled around the light posts like smoke, and the shadows stretched even longer, but there was nothing. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was just the late hour, or the isolation. Maybe I was simply too tired, too consumed by my own thoughts. But as I took a step forward, I felt it again, the voice. Closer this time. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a calling, like something deep within the earth was reaching up to me, pulling me toward it. My breath hitched. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural. This wasn't just the wind. This was something that was meant for me, something that had been waiting. It wasn't a voice that belonged to any living thing, and yet it called me with an urgency that I couldn't ignore. I swallowed hard. My instincts told me to run, to flee, but my legs didn't move. My feet were glued to the pavement. The night around me felt suffocating, closing in, and yet I stood there, frozen, as the voice grew clearer. It was no longer a murmur, it was speaking to me, directly, the words slipping through the fog like secrets I wasn't meant to hear. "Come closer," it said, a voice both sweet and cold. "You have questions. We have answers." My body trembled, but I didn't move. I didn't dare. A cold sweat broke out on my skin, the air around me growing thicker with each passing second. I knew I should leave. But the pull, the lure of the voice, it was too strong. And then I felt it, like a shift, a change. The air had thickened to the point where it felt as if I was moving through water, slow, heavy, each step a struggle. But I was drawn to it, to the voice, to whatever it was that called me from the depths of the night. I wanted to scream, to break free, but I couldn't. The world around me began to distort, the street I had walked down 1,000 times now unfamiliar, like a dream where nothing made sense. The fog was no longer just mist, it was alive, twisting, whispering, curling like fingers around my mind. The voice spoke again, this time clearer, stronger. You don't need to be afraid. Come to us, and you will understand. The answers you seek are waiting. I could feel the ground shift beneath me, the earth trembling as though it, too, was responding to the voice. The walls of the world were beginning to crack, reality itself slipping away. But I was too scared to move. Too scared to even think. The voice was growing louder, and the shadows seemed to stretch further, closer, consuming everything around me. I was no longer alone. There was something else here, something that had always been here, waiting. And now it had found me. The night was calling, and I was listening. I tried to breathe, to focus, but the voice, it didn't let me. It wrapped around my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts with whispers. I felt it more than I heard it, this overwhelming pull, like gravity itself was changing, dragging me deeper into the fog, deeper into whatever waited out there in the darkness. The street, once familiar, was now an endless stretch of mist. The dim lights of the lampposts flickered like dying stars, casting long, trembling shadows that twisted unnaturally. The fog, thick and suffocating, pressed in all around me. My skin crawled, each breath more difficult than the last, as if the air itself was charged with a silent, unseen force. I looked around, desperate for something solid, something to anchor me to the world I knew. But there was nothing, just the endless fog and the whispers that seemed to come from every direction, though I couldn't pinpoint their source. Come closer, the voice beckoned, this time much clearer, more insistent. The answers you seek are here. Come. My feet moved before I could stop them. Slowly at first, like I was fighting against a current, but with each step, the voice's pull became harder to resist. It was as if the fog itself was guiding me, pushing me forward, urging me to give in. I tried to shake my head, to clear the haze from my thoughts, but the voice was too powerful. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a weight that pressed on my chest, urging me to understand something I wasn't ready to. My legs moved of their own accord, and I found myself walking deeper into the fog, my footsteps muffled against the wet pavement. The deeper I went, the more the atmosphere changed. The fog thickened, swirling around me like it had a mind of its own. The sounds of the world outside seemed to vanish. There was no rustling of trees, no distant hum of traffic, just this all-consuming silence punctuated by the voice. It didn't sound like a human voice anymore. There was something ancient about it, something that didn't belong to this world. It had a rhythm, a cadence, like an incantation. Every time I tried to think, the voice seemed to invade my thoughts, pushing me further away from my own reality. I stumbled forward, nearly tripping over something solid in the fog. I reached out instinctively, my hands grazing something smooth, cold. The shape of it felt wrong. It wasn't a bench or a pole, nothing familiar. It was like I had touched the edge of something, something beyond my understanding. My heart raced. I yanked my hand away, panic rising in my chest. But then, the voice whispered again, softer this time, almost tender, like it was consoling me. You're close now. I froze. The fog parted ever so slightly, revealing a figure. A silhouette standing just a few feet away, barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't see its face, only the shadow of a tall, thin figure, like a person draped in a cloak. The voice came again, this time from the figure itself. "We've been waiting for you." I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey. All I could do was stare at the figure, as its presence seemed to draw all the air from the space around me. The fog wrapped tighter, and I felt the ground beneath me begin to tremble. The figure took a step forward, its movements smooth, unnatural, like it wasn't walking so much as gliding. "Come closer," it said, its voice now a chorus, an unholy symphony of whispers. "You know why you're here." I wanted to scream, to run, to break free from whatever hold this thing had on me. But I couldn't. The words it spoke, the voice, it was as if my mind was sinking with it, each breath, each thought, becoming more aligned with the figure's presence. A memory flashed in my mind. A distant echo. A forgotten moment I hadn't thought about in years. It was a sound, my mother's voice, calling me, but different. Distorted. As if it had traveled through something dark, something wrong. The same voice, now twisted, now calling me into the fog. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it or if it had been real. But the more I thought about it, the more the figure seemed to grow, becoming something far more than a mere shadow. It was real. It had always been real. The figure stepped closer, and I felt a strange pressure in the air, like the very space around me was bending. "You've been running from this your whole life," it whispered, now directly in my ear. "But you can't escape it." The voice surged through me like a flood, drowning all my thoughts in an overwhelming tide. For a brief moment, I saw flashes, images, memories. Moments from my childhood, my past, all twisted and distorted. Faces I knew, but not quite the way they should be. It was as if I was seeing fragments of my own life unravel, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. My head spun. I reached out to steady myself against the cold stone of a nearby wall, but there was nothing solid left. The ground had turned to mist beneath me, and I felt myself falling, sinking into the fog. My heart thudded in my chest, my mind screaming, but no sound came out. The figure's form began to distort, shifting, melting into the fog itself. But its voice remained. Clear. Eternal. "You will understand soon enough," it promised. And then the fog closed in, and I was alone again. But the voice didn't stop. It followed me, calling me, whispering my name, drawing me deeper into the night. The fog didn't lift. It never seemed to. It wrapped around me, thick and suffocating, a constant companion as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I had been here, but not here. I had heard it, seen it, felt it, the pull, the whisper, the figure in the dark. But now, I was alone, or so I thought. I stumbled through the thick haze, the ground soft under my feet, as though the world itself was made of some sort of damp cloth. The familiar had turned foreign. The road that had once led me home now twisted and stretched in ways that didn't make sense. I looked behind me, but there was nothing. No figure. No fog that parted to reveal what I had seen moments ago. Only the endless mist. Was it real? Was it a dream? A nightmare? I couldn't tell anymore. My mind felt like it was fracturing, slipping between worlds. It felt like I was being pulled, not just through space, but through time, as if every step I took stretched the present, distorting it, making it longer and more fragile. The fog closed in, muffling all sound, leaving me in a suffocating silence. It was almost worse than the whispers. At least the whispers had a direction, a voice that called me. Now, there was nothing. The absence of sound pressed against my eardrums, leaving me with the thudding of my own heartbeat. And then, I heard it again. A faint sound, far off in the distance. It was barely audible, but unmistakable footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I froze. At first, I thought I had imagined it. But the sound came again, and this time, I couldn't deny it. Someone, or something, was following me. But the fog was so thick, I couldn't see a thing, not even the shadows I had grown used to. I turned quickly, my breath caught in my throat, but there was no one. The street was empty. The lamplights flickered in the distance, like dim stars struggling to stay alive. The footsteps stopped. I wasn't sure if they had ever really been there. I looked over my shoulder, my hands trembling. A cold sweat started to form on the back of my neck. Was it real? Had I simply imagined it in my panic? The silence felt suffocating again. I couldn't stay here, not like this. I had to move. I turned and hurried down the street, my footsteps louder than the ones I had imagined. I didn't dare look back. Every nerve in my body was screaming for me to keep moving, but my mind couldn't stop. It kept replaying the figure, the whispers, the moment when everything had felt so wrong, so otherworldly. What was it? Who had been calling me? Was it some trick of the fog? Or something far worse? The air felt heavy. Every breath I took seemed thicker than the last, like the air itself was alive, pressing against my chest. I felt like I was suffocating, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. And then I saw something barely visible through the haze, but unmistakable. A shape. A figure standing at the edge of the street, partially obscured by the fog. I stopped, my feet frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. The figure stood there, unmoving. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and the darkness around it seemed to pulse like a living thing. It wasn't the same figure I had seen before, but it didn't matter. The feeling was the same. A presence that felt ancient and foreign, something that didn't belong in this world, let alone on this street. Come closer, the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just in my head. The words came from the figure itself, clear as day. My legs shook. I wanted to run, to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The figure took a step forward, and the ground trembled beneath me. It was as if the earth itself recognized its presence, shuddering with some long-forgotten knowledge. My skin crawled as I stared at it, unable to tear my eyes away. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath, caught in the fog. But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward again, its movements smooth, almost liquid. The fog seemed to part around it, creating a path that led straight to where I stood. My feet were rooted to the ground, my heart pounding in my chest. "Come," the voice urged, now coming from everywhere, from within my own mind, from the figure, from the very air around me. "You know why you're here." I shook my head, tears of frustration filling my eyes. I don't know." But the figure was not listening. It continued to glide closer, the mist swirling around its feet, as though it had no need to walk on solid ground. The closer it came, the colder the air grew. It felt like ice was creeping into my bones, chilling me from the inside out. I shivered violently, but I couldn't move. "Answer us," it whispered, and this time the voice wasn't just one. There were many, layered over each other, like a chorus of lost souls. I tried to speak, to force words out, but my mouth was dry, my throat tight. No words came. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its presence filling the space. I could barely make out its features through the fog, tall, impossibly thin, and with skin that shimmered like moonlight on water. There were no eyes, just empty hollows where they should have been, as if it was something that had never been fully alive. "Do you want to know the truth?" it asked, its voice low and smooth, like velvet scraping against glass. "The truth about who you are, about what's been calling to you all this time?" My heart stopped. I didn't want to know. I wasn't ready for the truth. But the fog seemed to thicken again, pressing closer, as if it would suffocate me if I didn't listen. I didn't have a choice. "Yes," I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice over the sound of my racing pulse. And then, as if it had been waiting for that answer, the figure's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was something darker, something ancient. Something that knew exactly what I was afraid of. The voice in my head whispered again, but this time the words were clearer. They were my own. "You've always known," it said. "You just didn't want to believe it." The figure raised its hand, pointing toward the fog. And as I followed its gesture, the mist parted just enough to reveal something I hadn't noticed before. A door. The door loomed before me, its dark wood old and worn, like it had been standing there for centuries, hidden beneath the thick fog. I didn't see it until the figure pointed, and now it was all I could focus on. The air around it felt colder, as though the door itself was pulling the warmth from the world. The mist curled around it like something alive, wrapping its tendrils in tight coils as if guarding it, or perhaps guiding me toward it. I could feel my breath shallow, my chest tight. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run. But my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot. Every nerve in my body told me to stay away, to reject what I was seeing. But I couldn't. The fog, the figure, the voice, it all seemed to be pulling me in, leading me toward that cursed door. The figure stepped aside, revealing the door completely. It was no longer just a shadow in the mist. It was real, solid, and as I stared at it, the feeling of something ancient and powerful stirred deep within me. The air crackled with tension, like the moment before a storm. I couldn't shake the sensation that whatever lay behind that door, whatever the figure was leading me to, was going to change everything. "You're not afraid, are you?" The figure's voice was low, mocking, but there was a coldness in its tone that made my skin crawl. It stepped closer, its presence towering over me, despite the distance. The fog pressed in again, tighter, and I could feel the weight of the figure's gaze upon me. It was not human, no, nothing about it was. There was a darkness to it, an unnatural stillness that made the world around it seem to bend. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to ground myself in reality. But everything felt wrong, like I had stepped out of the world I knew and into something else entirely. I couldn't look away from the door. It felt like it was calling me, pulling me in with an irresistible force. I could hear whispers again, louder now, not just in my mind, but coming from the very wood of the door itself, scratching at my thoughts. I was terrified, but I was also compelled. "Do you understand now?" the figure asked, its voice slipping into my thoughts like a snake. "You've always known. You've always been part of this." I wanted to scream, to reject it, but I couldn't. My hand reached out, almost against my will, trembling as I placed it against the cool, weathered wood of the door. It felt alive, pulsing beneath my fingers. My heart skipped a beat as I heard the faintest of sounds, the creak of hinges, the faint groan of wood shifting. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices all speaking at once, but none of them in a language I could understand. It was like they were calling me, beckoning me to open the door, to walk through it and accept whatever lay on the other side. The fog seemed to grow thicker, heavier around me, and I could barely see the figure anymore. It had faded into the mist, its presence still palpable but distant, watching me from the edges of my perception. I hesitated. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn away, to forget this madness. But the door felt like the answer. It felt like the only thing that could finally make sense of the chaos swirling around me. The mystery that had plagued my thoughts, the whispers, the strange figure, the feeling that I was being watched, they all led here, to this door. With a shaking breath, I grasped the handle. The moment I touched it, the air seemed to snap. The whispers stopped, and in the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and erratic, thudding in my chest. My fingers curled around the cold metal handle, and without thinking, I turned it. The door creaked open, slow and deliberate, and as it did, a rush of cold air spilled out from behind it, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of something long forgotten, damp earth, decay, and something older. A sense of inevitability washed over me, and I stepped forward, drawn in like a moth to a flame. What I saw on the other side, I wasn't ready for. It wasn't a room, not exactly. It felt like the inside of a mind, twisting, shifting, ever-changing. The walls were made of shadows, flickering in and out of existence, as though they were trying to form something solid but never quite succeeding. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, pressing down on me, suffocating me. And in the distance, barely visible, were shapes, figures moving in the shadows, indistinct and shifting, like they weren't quite part of this world. I took a step forward, and the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing like thunder. The sudden noise was enough to shake me from my trance. My breath caught in my throat, and I spun around, expecting to find myself trapped. But the door was gone. The doorway had vanished as if it had never existed at all. I was in a place that felt like nowhere. The shadows closed in on me, curling around my limbs, whispering secrets I couldn't hear, yet I could feel them in my bones, in my very soul. Something was watching me, but I couldn't see it. The shapes in the distance seemed to move closer, closer, as though they were aware of my presence, closing in on me from all sides. "Do you see now?" The voice came again, not from the figure, but from everywhere. From the shadows, from the air, from the very ground beneath my feet. "Do you understand what you are?" I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The weight of the place, the heaviness of the darkness pressing in on me, made it hard to breathe, let alone speak. Every step I took felt like it was pulling me deeper into something that wasn't just physical. It was like my mind was being pulled, stretched thin, unraveling under the pressure of whatever force had brought me here. The shadows moved again, closer now, and I realized something. I wasn't alone. The shadows didn't just move, they shifted. They weren't simply things in the dark, creeping closer to me. No, they were something else. Something more. They were alive, bending and warping, as if they were made of the same strange substance as the fog that had followed me here. And as they closed in, I could hear them. Their movement, their whispers, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. They spoke in a language that crawled beneath my skin, a sound so alien that my mind could barely comprehend it. I felt it in my bones, in the hollow places of my soul. They weren't speaking to me, they were speaking through me. I could feel the words entering my mind, not just as sounds, but as sensations, as thoughts. Thoughts I didn't recognize, thoughts that weren't mine. Do you see it yet? The voice was familiar now, but it wasn't comforting. It was cold, distant, like an old memory stirring from the depths. You've always known, you just refused to listen. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking as I tried to focus, tried to understand. The figures in the distance were closer now, no longer flickering shadows, but full-fledged shapes, humanoid in form, but wrong, twisted and broken in ways I couldn't fully grasp. Their faces, if you could even call them faces, were covered in shifting patches of darkness, as if their features were in constant flux, never solid, never real. There were too many of them. I didn't know how many, but I could feel their eyes, if they had them, watching me. They didn't need to speak for me to understand that they were not here to help. They were here for something else, something far darker than I could fathom. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as though the very ground beneath me had turned to quicksand, pulling me in, holding me down. The shadows closed in on me, tightening their grip. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. They were speaking faster now, their words crashing into each other, drowning me in their cacophony. "Your mind is open," one voice hissed. "We can finally show you." Another voice, lower, raspier, whispered, "You've been chosen." Chosen. The word echoed in my mind, reverberating off the walls of my thoughts like a drumbeat. I didn't understand it, but I felt it. A part of me, deep inside, knew exactly what they meant. No. I couldn't accept it. I wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't real. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could taste the bitter sting of panic rising in my throat. My breath came in short gasps, my heart pounding in my chest like a hammer on steel. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up, how much longer I could stand here, surrounded by things that weren't human, things that weren't real. But as I stood there, trapped by the darkness, I felt something else, something cold, deep, and ancient, brush against the edges of my mind. Something that made me stop fighting, stop struggling. Something that made me understand. I wasn't trapped by the shadows, by the figures or the whispers. No, I was trapped by myself. Do you remember? The voice came again, soft and insistent, like a forgotten dream clawing its way to the surface of my mind. You were always meant to be here. The figures closed in further, their movements fluid, unnatural. And as they did, the truth hit me like a wave, crashing through my thoughts, sweeping away the illusion of normality I had clung to for so long. The door. The door was a way in, not just into this place, but into me. I hadn't been brought here by some external force. No, I had opened the door. I had walked through it, and now I had to face the consequences. The door had never been something physical, it had always been a threshold in my mind, a crack in my consciousness that I had ignored for so long. But it had always been there, waiting for me to finally open it. You were one of us, the voice whispered again, and now it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like an invitation. The figures, these beings, weren't strangers. They weren't demons or ghosts or monsters. They were me. They were the things that I had buried deep within myself, the fears, the guilt, the pain, the doubts. The part of me that had always known, but that I had never let in. And now, it had all come rushing forward. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. The air felt colder, heavier, suffocating. The fog closed in around me, pressing on my chest, but I didn't fight it. I couldn't. There was no escape. There was only the truth. I wasn't running from the shadows anymore. I had become them, and there was nothing left to do but accept it. As I sat there in the dark, surrounded by the figures of my own making, the whispers finally stopped. The silence that followed was louder than any sound. It was suffocating, consuming. It wasn't the absence of noise, but the absence of everything. And then, the door opened again. Have you ever felt like the world around you is filled with remnants of something once beautiful, now shattered beyond recognition? I did, one foggy evening, as I wandered through the narrow streets near the old gallery. It wasn't my plan to visit, but something about that place always called to me. Something intangible, like a whisper from the past, urging me to look deeper. The gallery was an ancient building, its walls worn and cracked by the hands of time. The windows were dust-covered, the glass fogged with years of neglect. As I stood before it, the air seemed to grow still, as if the world had momentarily paused, holding its breath. I could hear nothing, no distant traffic, no chirping birds, not even the rustle of leaves. Just an eerie, all-consuming silence. The kind that sinks into your bones, making every small noise feel amplified, as though the universe itself was watching. Inside, the gallery was even more unsettling. The walls, lined with the remnants of paintings long forgotten, seemed to lean in, as if whispering their stories to anyone who would listen. But those stories were broken. Torn fragments of color and line lay scattered on the floor, each piece a memory half remembered, a dream half lived. Some images were recognizable, a woman's face, a tree's twisted branches, but they were incomplete, their edges ragged, as if some force had violently torn them apart. I stood in the center of the room, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. The atmosphere pressed in on me, suffocating, yet I couldn't bring myself to leave. There was something about these fragments that stirred something deep within me. A strange familiarity. A sensation that these broken images were not just pieces of forgotten art, they were reflections of something far more personal. Something I had tried so hard to bury. I bent down to examine a nearby shard of canvas. The torn edges were raw, as if freshly cut. The painting had once depicted a scene of a peaceful village, but now it was nothing but a blur of colors, faded reds and muted browns. As I touched the edge, a strange sensation crawled across my skin, like the painting itself was still alive, still remembering. I pulled my hand back sharply, my pulse quickening. The silence around me had thickened, like the air was suddenly heavier. The walls seemed to close in, the floor beneath my feet creaking in protest. I could hear it now, faint whispers, just on the edge of my hearing. Were they real? Or was I losing my mind? The room seemed to warp and shift, the dim light flickering, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. I turned toward the door to leave, but it was as if the room itself was holding me captive. My footsteps echoed in the stillness, but the echoes didn't sound like my own. They sounded wrong, distant, yet too close, as though something unseen was moving right behind me, matching my pace. I spun around, but nothing was there. The gallery was as still as ever, the paintings torn and faded, their stories lost to time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the room was watching me, listening. I had to leave. I had to get out. But as I reached for the door, I froze. A small shard of glass caught my eye, half buried in the dust on the floor. It reflected the faintest glimmer of light, but it was what it was reflecting that stopped me. A face. Not my own. It was pale, distorted, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight into me. I blinked, and the reflection was gone. I rushed to the door, yanking it open, but the world outside felt different. The streets, the buildings, they were no longer the familiar ones I had walked through every day. They were unfamiliar, twisted. The air was thicker now, heavier with the weight of something I couldn't name. The gallery loomed behind me, its windows dark, its walls silent. But I could still feel it. The broken dreams, the lost hopes. They were still calling to me, pulling at the very fabric of my soul. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape them. And as I turned to walk away, a single word echoed in my mind like a whispered promise from the past. Remember. I tried to walk away, but every step I took felt heavier than the last. The world outside the gallery was no longer what it had been moments ago. The streets I once knew seemed unfamiliar, warped by an unseen force. Buildings loomed too tall, their windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring into the abyss. The sky above was a dull, overcast gray, but it felt suffocating, as if the air itself was thick with something I couldn't see. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as the oppressive weight of it all pressed down on me. I looked around, but everything seemed to blur together. The houses, the streetlights, the trees, everything was just a dark smear in my vision, as though the world was being drained of its color. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but every thought felt like it was slipping through my fingers. What was happening? Why couldn't I remember the way back? And then, from somewhere behind me, I heard the whispers again. Faint at first, like the rustling of wind through leaves, but they grew louder, more insistent. The voices weren't speaking words, not exactly. They were feelings, echoes of emotions long forgotten. The sorrow of lost dreams, the despair of unfulfilled desires. It was as if the very earth around me was mourning something, something important, something personal. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was nothing there. The gallery stood in the distance, its broken windows now reflecting the pale, sickly light that poured from the overcast sky. It looked wrong, as if it had grown larger, more menacing, since I had stepped outside. I took a step back. A distant memory flickered in my mind, like a half-remembered dream. I had seen this place before, or at least something like it. The broken paintings, the torn remnants of once beautiful images, they seemed familiar, like pieces of a puzzle I was supposed to put together but had forgotten how. I shook my head. No, I couldn't be thinking about this. I needed to get out of here. I needed to find my way back to some semblance of normalcy. But as I turned to leave, the whispers grew louder. They were no longer just voices, they were faces, phantom-like figures swirling in the corners of my vision. I could feel their presence, like they were brushing against me, their cold fingers trailing down my spine. I closed my eyes, trying to block them out, but when I opened them again, they were still there. Just out of sight. Always on the edge of my perception, waiting to reveal themselves. I walked faster, my footsteps quickening as I tried to put distance between myself and the gallery, but the ground beneath me seemed to shift with every step. The cobblestones, once firm beneath my feet, now felt uneven, like they were shifting beneath me, threatening to give way at any moment. And then, from behind me, I heard a sound. A soft, delicate sound at first, like the flutter of paper. But it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable, the sound of footsteps. But they weren't my own. They were heavier, slower, as if something or someone was following me, moving at the same pace, just out of reach. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat as I slowly turned to face whatever was behind me. But there was nothing. Just empty streets. Empty buildings. The world had become an endless labyrinth, and I was trapped inside it. I could feel the weight of those invisible eyes on me, watching, waiting. I knew that whatever was following me wasn't human. It was something else. Something ancient. Something that had always been here, hidden beneath the surface of the world I once knew. I needed to find the gallery. I needed to understand what was happening before it was too late. But when I tried to turn back, the path had changed. The familiar street I had walked down moments ago had twisted, its shape now unrecognizable. The houses had shifted, the trees had moved. The world around me was no longer a place of logic. It was something far more insidious. The whispers were louder now, their voices growing clearer, more distinct. And among them, I heard one that stood out, soft and low, but unmistakable. Remember, you have always been here. I shuddered, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. It felt like a warning, like a truth I wasn't ready to face. I had to get back to the gallery. But with each step I took, the world around me seemed to unravel more, like a painting coming undone, its colors bleeding into one another until nothing remained but chaos. And that's when I saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the fog, I could make out the silhouette of the gallery. But it was no longer a building. It was something far worse, a twisted, corrupted version of itself. Its windows were now hollowed-out eyes, its door a gaping mouth that seemed to swallow all light. And above it, on the cracked stone wall, there was something written in what looked like blood. A name. My name. I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the ground, my body frozen in place. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a silence so deep it made my ears ring. The world had gone completely still, as if holding its breath. And then I heard it. A sound. A voice, not in the air but in my mind, deep and cold, like the voice of the gallery itself. You shouldn't have come. I turned to run, but the ground beneath me shifted and the path forward disappeared. There was nowhere left to go. The gallery was all that remained. And I could hear it now, more clearly than ever, the sound of something moving inside, something waiting. I took one last look at the words written on the wall, but blood-stained letters that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. And then, before I could stop myself, I stepped forward. Into the darkness. I stepped through the doorway, my body trembling as I crossed the threshold. The moment I did, the air around me grew heavy, thick with an oppressive, suffocating presence. The silence was deafening, no wind, no rustle of leaves, no distant sounds of life. It was as though the world beyond this place had ceased to exist. The gallery was no longer a mere building, it had become something else entirely, a living, breathing entity that consumed everything it touched. The dim light from the broken windows barely illuminated the hallway ahead of me. It was cold, colder than I had ever felt before. My breath hung in the air like smoke, swirling in the unnatural stillness. Each step I took echoed loudly, my feet tapping softly on the cracked tiles, though I could feel my every movement slowed, as if the very space around me was resisting my presence. The walls were covered in layers of dust and decay, the once pristine plaster now yellowed and cracked. The paintings, what was left of them, were no longer mere fragments of broken dreams. They were alive, pulsing, each piece a canvas for something grotesque and unfinished. Faces stared at me from every direction, eyes that followed my every move, mouths that twisted into silent screams, their features distorted and monstrous. Each fragment seemed to whisper to me in a language I could not understand, its meaning lost in the space between worlds. I couldn't look away, even as a deep sense of dread washed over me. My feet moved of their own accord, pulling me deeper into the heart of the gallery. The walls seemed to stretch and bend with each step, their angles becoming more obtuse, the hallway growing longer, narrower. I turned a corner and found myself in a large, open space, the gallery's central room. It was a grand hall, or at least it had once been, its high ceiling lost in the shadows, its once gleaming floors now covered in grime and broken glass. But it wasn't the room itself that made my heart race, it was what lay in the center. In the middle of the room, surrounded by the shattered remnants of artwork, stood a figure. At first, I thought it was just another painting, another distorted image left behind in the wake of the gallery's fall. But as I approached, I realized it wasn't a painting at all. It was real, and it was alive. A figure, tall and thin, draped in a cloak of dark fabric, stood motionless. Its face was obscured by shadows, its features hidden, but I could feel its eyes on me. They burned into my skin, cold and unblinking. My pulse quickened. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand answers, but no sound came out. My throat tightened as if the air had turned to cement, blocking any attempt to form words. The silence around me deepened, and for a moment, I felt like I was drowning in it, the pressure of it crushing me from all sides. And then, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world. It lifted a hand, and the shadows surrounding its face parted just enough for me to see, just enough for me to glimpse the hollow, empty eyes staring back at me. Eyes that were not human. Eyes that were nothing but voids, dark and endless. There was no humanity in them, no warmth, no soul. Just an abyss that pulled at my very being. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet remained rooted to the spot. The figure's hand began to move in a slow, circular motion, tracing invisible patterns in the air. The shadows around it rippled like water, distorting everything they touched, including the space around me. The paintings on the walls seemed to twist and writhe in response, the images in them becoming more grotesque, more nightmarish. I could feel my heart racing, my breath coming faster as the air around me thickened. The temperature had dropped even further, and I felt the cold crawl under my skin, into my bones. I tried to speak again, to demand answers, but still, no sound escaped me. My mouth was dry, my tongue heavy in my mouth. And then, a voice broke through the silence. It was low, soft, almost a whisper, but it felt like it was resonating inside my very mind. You shouldn't have come. The words echoed in my head, vibrating through my skull. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if the voice itself had frozen me in place, holding me captive in this nightmare. I tried to scream, to break free from the grip that the figure had on me, but it was impossible. My body refused to obey, my thoughts trapped within the confines of my own mind. The figure took a step forward, its presence looming over me like a shadow. Its face remained obscured, but I could feel the weight of its gaze, its endless eyes burrowing deep into me, tearing at the fabric of my sanity. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, more urgent. The broken fragments of the paintings seemed to call to me, each piece adding to the chorus of voices. They were no longer just fragments, they were a part of this place, a part of the nightmare I had stumbled into. The figure raised its hand again, and I felt the shadows around me twist tighter, the walls closing in. The paintings on the walls flickered, shifting from one image to another in a constant cycle of torment. Faces, broken and distorted, stared at me with pleading eyes. Eyes that begged for release. Eyes that begged for mercy. And then, the figure spoke again. This time, its voice was clearer, more distinct, and I could hear the words with terrible clarity. "You are one of them now." My heart stopped. My blood froze. I didn't understand. What did it mean? What did I have to do with this? But before I could process the words, the figure took one more step toward me. And then everything went black. The darkness swallowed me whole, an abyss so complete that it left no trace of light, no space for breath. I tried to move, to scream, but there was nothing. My limbs were heavy, as if trapped in some viscous fluid. Panic began to claw at the edges of my consciousness, but the more I struggled, the more it seemed as though the darkness was tightening its grip, pulling me deeper into its void. It felt like hours, or was it seconds? Time lost all meaning. All I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat pulsing in my ears, deafening in the silence. And then, a whisper. Soft, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But it wasn't natural. It was wrong. The sound came from all around me, 1,000 voices, each one straining to be heard over the others. They were whispering words I couldn't understand, their cadence jumbled, distorted. Yet somehow, I could feel their weight, their urgency. I opened my mouth to speak, but once again, no sound emerged. The whispers grew louder, their tone growing darker, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but the feeling was unmistakable. Something was watching me. And that something wasn't human. In the center of the void, I thought I saw something move, a figure, darker than the surrounding darkness, shifting like a shadow. It had no distinct shape, no form, but I could feel its presence drawing closer. My chest tightened, the weight of dread pressing against my ribs. The air felt thick, like I was suffocating, but still, I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was frozen in place, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. And then, like a splinter in my mind, a memory flickered into my consciousness. The gallery. The paintings. The figure. The whispering figure had said something. "You are one of them now." The words hit me like a wave crashing against the shore. I had no idea what they meant, but somehow I knew I had to understand. Suddenly, the darkness around me shifted. It wasn't just a void anymore, it was a place, a space that was trying to form itself. The walls, the floors, they were there, but they weren't real. They were distorted, like reflections in a cracked mirror. The space around me seemed to pulse, like it was breathing. I could feel its rhythm, its heartbeat, and I realized I wasn't alone. I tried to take a step, to regain some control, but the floor beneath me was slick, shifting beneath my feet. I stumbled, caught off guard, and nearly fell. My hands pressed against what should have been a wall, but instead of feeling solid wood or stone, my fingers brushed against something wrong. It was slick, oily, warm. I recoiled, disgust crawling up my spine. Then, the whispers returned. Louder now. I couldn't understand them, but they felt familiar. They felt like they were coming from inside my head. They knew me. They were waiting for me. The air grew colder. I could see my breath now, the mist swirling in front of me, distorting the space even further. The shadows around me began to lengthen, stretching like thin, elongated fingers, reaching toward me, clawing at my skin. They whispered louder, their words more urgent, more demanding. One word began to stand out from the rest, repeating over and over again like a chant. Release, release, release. What were they asking me to release? What did they want? And then, a single figure emerged from the darkness. It wasn't the figure from before, but it was someone else. A woman, her face obscured by long, tangled hair. She seemed to float just above the ground, her movements unnaturally smooth. Her eyes were dark, hollow, empty, like the void I had just escaped. Her lips moved, but no sound came from them. Still, the whispers grew louder, reverberating off the walls of this space, and I realized they were coming from her. She raised her arms slowly, her fingers extending toward me. The shadows that had been creeping toward me now flared, stretching along her arm like tendrils of dark smoke. I stepped back, fear coursing through me. My heart pounded harder now, and the oppressive atmosphere began to suffocate me again, each breath more difficult than the last. My vision swam, my thoughts hazy, but through the panic, I understood. This woman, this thing, was the key to whatever this place was. The whispers, the darkness, the figures, they were all connected, all pulling me deeper into their world. And she wanted something. She needed something from me. I didn't want to know what it was. I turned and ran. The darkness around me shifted again, the ground beneath my feet unstable, the walls warping, expanding and contracting like the belly of some great beast. I could hear the woman's voice now, faint but growing louder, echoing through the twisting corridors of my mind. Release. Release. I stumbled through the darkness, my hands reaching out, brushing against surfaces I couldn't see, hoping for something solid to ground me. But there was nothing but the endless, suffocating blackness. The shadows clung to me, dragging at my limbs, whispering, urging me to stop. I didn't stop. I couldn't allow myself to stop. Not while the whispers were still clawing at my mind, not while the shadowy figures were so close. I felt something brush against my neck, a cold, clammy touch, and I screamed. I didn't know if the scream was real. I didn't know if any of this was real. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was getting away. And then, suddenly, a door appeared in front of me. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself toward it, my hands grasping for the handle, and in one frantic motion, I twisted it open. The air shifted, cool, fresh, the scent of rain filling my lungs. I stepped through, into the unknown. But as the door slammed shut behind me, the whispers stopped. The silence returned. And I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was waiting on the other side. I didn't know what I expected when I stepped through the door. Perhaps daylight, or the safety of familiarity. But what I found was far from either. The world around me felt different, too still, too quiet. I stood in a room that didn't belong to me. The walls were peeling, the air thick with dust and age. It was as though I had walked into a place frozen in time, a space that didn't recognize me, didn't welcome me. The faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic in the air, and as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized where I was. The gallery. The very same one I had passed earlier that night, the one that had haunted my thoughts ever since I had stepped into its crumbling halls. But something was wrong. The room before me was familiar, yet distorted. The paintings on the walls were the same, but their edges were frayed, their colors faded, as if time had not just passed, but torn them apart. Every image felt warped, every figure in the portraits twisted, their eyes hollow and accusing. They seemed to stare at me, not with the indifference of art, but with a deep, knowing hunger. I stepped forward, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath me. My heart was still racing, my breath shallow, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the images. The whispers from the other side of the door had faded, but the feeling remained, the presence lurking just beyond the veil of reality. As I moved deeper into the room, my fingers brushed the frames of the paintings, cold to the touch, like stone. The fragments of broken dreams. That's what they felt like now, pieces of something that once had meaning, but now only reflected a hollow emptiness. A distorted version of something beautiful that had once been whole. I turned towards the center of the room, where a large, ornate mirror hung against the wall. It was out of place, its polished surface reflecting the dim light from the single bulb above me. The glass seemed to shimmer, almost alive, as though it held something more than just my reflection. I moved closer, my steps hesitant, my body tense. The closer I got, the more I felt a pull, an urge to look into the mirror. But part of me hesitated, sensing something wrong. Something that didn't belong. My reflection stared back at me, as it should. But there was a difference. In the reflection, my eyes were wide, bloodshot, filled with panic. My face was pale, the skin stretched tight over my bones, as if I had been trapped here for far longer than I realized. But it was my hands that caught my attention. They weren't the hands I knew. They were too pale, too long. The fingers twisted unnaturally, like the branches of a dead tree. I raised one hand to my face, but in the mirror, my reflection didn't mirror the movement. Instead, it slowly lifted its own hand, fingers curling into a claw, and the twisted smile that spread across its face wasn't mine. The figure in the mirror was me. But it wasn't me. I felt the room spin, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. I tried to look away, to break the connection, but my feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen in place, rooted to the spot, as if the mirror had locked me in place with its gaze. Release, the whisper came again, clear and sharp now, as though it were coming from within the mirror itself. My blood ran cold. The figure in the mirror began to move, its hand stretching toward the glass, reaching for me. My body trembled, but I couldn't move. I could only watch as its hand touched the surface of the mirror, the coldness radiating through the glass and into my skin. It felt like ice, like it was pulling me toward it. The air grew heavier, and I realized this wasn't real. Or at least, it shouldn't have been. The room felt wrong, the reflection twisted. Nothing about this was natural. It was as though the world I was in was breaking, shattering into pieces, just like the paintings on the walls. A world out of sync, a reality that was unraveling. I snapped out of my trance, my body finally responding to the panic that had gripped me. I stumbled backward, but before I could turn away, the mirror's surface rippled. The reflection of my twisted self began to reach out, its fingers stretching farther than they should, its grin widening unnaturally, as though it were hungry for something more than just my gaze. With a scream, I turned and ran, my feet stumbling over the floor, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers returned, but this time, they weren't coming from the mirror, they were coming from everywhere. From the walls, the floor, the very air around me. They were all around me, urging me to stop, to stay, to release. But I couldn't stop. I had to get out. I had to escape. I didn't know what this place was, but I knew one thing for certain: I didn't belong here. I didn't belong in a world where the lines between reality and nightmare were blurred, where the past haunted the present, and where broken dreams took on a life of their own. I ran through the gallery, the paintings warping around me, the shadows lengthening, twisting, reaching toward me. The air was suffocating, and I could barely breathe, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not with that thing, that reflection, chasing me, demanding that I release whatever it wanted from me. I pushed through the door at the end of the room, the one that led outside, but when I stepped into the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. The hallway was gone. There was nothing but darkness. No exit. No way out. I was trapped. I spun around, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The door I had just come through was now gone, replaced with an endless expanse of blackness. The walls had disappeared, the floor beneath me was crumbling, and the air had turned thick with the oppressive weight of something unseen. I was back in the void. But this time, the whispers weren't just coming from the darkness. They were inside me. It was the full moon, but it wasn't just any moon. This one felt different. I could feel it the moment I stepped outside. The sky, clear and cold, hung heavy above me. Its pale light bathed everything in an eerie glow, but then I saw it. The moon shifted, turning from silver to a deep crimson. A blood moon, like something out of an ancient omen. And in that moment, I realized the night had its own laws, and I was nothing more than a speck in its vast, indifferent kingdom. I stood on the edge of the woods, just beyond the fence of the small cabin where I had been staying for the last few days. The cabin, an old wooden structure with peeling paint, seemed so ordinary during the day. But under the crimson gaze of the moon, it felt different, like it was watching me. I shook off the feeling, but it lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The air was unnervingly still. There were no birds singing, no wind rustling through the trees, just silence. A thick, suffocating silence that seemed to press against my eardrums like the world had held its breath. I tried to ignore it. The night had always been unsettling for me, ever since I was young. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, but something about this place, this night, felt wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could hear a faint sound, barely audible at first, like a low hum. It didn't belong to the wind or any creature I recognized. It was just there, pulsing in the air around me. I stepped back, my boots crunching on the gravel path that led to the cabin. I kept my gaze fixed on the blood moon, unable to look away. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt its pull. It was as though the moon itself was drawing me in, pulling me deeper into its unsettling glow. The trees seemed to stretch and bend toward the light, their branches like twisted fingers reaching for something just out of sight. I tried to turn away, but then the sound grew louder. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, someone, or something, walking through the woods. I froze. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but the footsteps didn't sound like that. They were too deliberate, too human. Slow. Calculated. My heart began to race, my chest tightening with unease. The air around me felt thicker now, heavier. I glanced over my shoulder at the cabin. It was too quiet. The door to the porch was slightly ajar, but I hadn't left it open. I hadn't gone near it since I stepped outside to take in the view. The footsteps continued. Closer now. I turned to face the woods, but I saw nothing. No shape, no figure, no movement, just the oppressive darkness beyond the reach of the moonlight. But the sound was unmistakable, like someone, or something, was walking just behind the trees, their presence so close I could feel it pressing against me. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to know what was out there. but I couldn't help it. I had to look. I slowly shifted my gaze back toward the cabin, where a figure now stood in the doorway. It wasn't anyone I recognized. A tall, dark silhouette, cloaked in shadows. It wasn't the moonlight that cast its shape, but something far darker, something that seemed to absorb the light around it. I couldn't make out its features, but the feeling it gave me was undeniable. It was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. My heart raced in my chest. I stepped backward, my legs shaky, my breath shallow. There was something deeply wrong about that figure, something unnatural. And yet, I couldn't look away. The moon, now fully crimson, seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, its light casting an unnatural glow on the scene. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to even speak. The figure in the doorway took a step forward, its presence so overwhelming that I felt the air around me grow colder. It was as though the night had deepened in that single moment, as if the world had shifted on its axis. I couldn't take it anymore. With a burst of panic, I turned and fled, my feet pounding against the gravel path as I sprinted toward the woods. The footsteps followed me, closer now, too close. I didn't dare look back. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, harsh and labored, just behind me, but it wasn't the sound of someone running. It was the sound of something following me. Something that didn't have to run. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my heart thudding in my chest. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist around me, trying to wrap me in their grasp. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, ragged and panicked, and the footsteps behind me. They were getting closer. I reached the edge of the woods and turned sharply, running toward the cabin. The figure was still there, standing at the door, waiting for me. But now, it was not alone. The shadows around it seemed to move, undulating like they had a life of their own. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as though the earth itself was shifting, warping. I stumbled forward, barely able to keep my footing. I tried to reach for the door, but my hands trembled so violently that I could barely grasp the handle. When I finally forced the door open, I rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. The cabin was no longer familiar. It was colder inside, and the silence, once comforting, now felt oppressive. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick with an unexplainable tension. I pressed my back against the door, trying to catch my breath, but it felt like the darkness was seeping through the cracks, pressing against me from all sides. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew one thing for certain: whatever it wasn't human. And it was still watching. I closed my eyes, but all I could see was the blood moon, its crimson light filling my vision like it had burned itself into my mind. I could feel it, even now, as though it had reached into me, taken something that could never be returned. The woods outside were silent again, but that oppressive feeling never left. I felt it in my bones, in my soul. It was waiting. And I was no longer sure whether I was still inside the cabin or whether it had somehow followed me inside. The moon had turned crimson, and the world had changed. The rules of reality no longer seemed to apply. And as I stood in the darkened cabin, I couldn't shake the thought: what if it wasn't just the moon that had changed? The door was locked. I made sure of it. My hands, trembling with fear, had turned the rusty old handle at least 3 times, just to be sure. But even as I pressed my back against it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence inside the cabin was suffocating, almost as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I glanced around. The furniture seemed to shift in the dim light, their shapes unfamiliar in the moon's strange glow. The once ordinary cabin felt less like a home and more like a trap. The wooden beams overhead creaked under the weight of some unseen pressure. The shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, curling around corners, pooling in places that didn't seem to make sense. I moved away from the door, cautiously stepping into the room. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath my weight. Every step felt like a betrayal, each one breaking the unnatural stillness of the place, like a scream in the dead of night. The shadows seemed to follow me, clinging to the edges of the room, whispering without words, urging me to keep moving. My eyes darted toward the small window near the far wall, but all I saw was the blood moon, its sickly red light filtering through the curtains like a wound in the sky. I could feel it, too. The pull of the moon, as if it were trying to draw me into its orbit, to make me one with its strange, otherworldly power. I forced myself to turn away. I wasn't alone. I tried to focus on the present, to find some thread of normalcy in the chaos swirling around me. The old rocking chair near the fireplace creaked, rocking back and forth on its own, though there was no breeze, no wind. Just the eerie motion, as though something unseen had sat in it and was now waiting. I shivered. The silence inside the cabin was broken only by the faintest of noises. A rustling. Low and almost imperceptible, like something moving in the walls. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was faint, but it wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. I edged closer to the fireplace, my eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. My breathing was shallow, erratic, as though the very act of breathing itself was becoming difficult. The air had thickened, turning heavy with something I couldn't identify. It wasn't just the oppressive stillness, either. It was the sense of wrongness, like the house was no longer a sanctuary, but a cage. I should have left. I knew that. But there was nowhere to run. The woods outside seemed endless, the dark trees reaching toward me like grasping hands. I'd seen something out there. That figure in the doorway, it wasn't just a trick of the moonlight. I was sure of it. My eyes flickered back to the rocking chair. The motion had stopped. The room had fallen into a deep, unsettling stillness. Then I heard it. A knock. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. At the window. I slowly turned toward it. My breath caught in my throat. The window was now completely dark. The curtains had been drawn back slightly when I first looked, but now they were pressed tight against the glass, as though someone, or something, was on the other side. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move. The air grew even colder, and I could see my breath in front of me in small, shaky clouds. It wasn't just the temperature. It was something else. A presence. Something ancient, something powerful, and it was waiting for me to make the next move. The knock came again, louder this time. The sound wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside. The walls. The floor. Something was inside the cabin with me. I staggered backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the pressure of the space closing in on me, pushing me toward the center of the room, where the shadows seemed the deepest. My eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the room, of my surroundings. The faint rustling behind the walls grew louder, as if whatever it was had heard my panic and was now closing in. Then I saw it. The silhouette in the window was no longer just a shadow. It had a shape now, a figure that seemed to be outlined in the blood moon's glow. But it wasn't human. The shape was wrong. the proportions distorted, like something trying to mimic humanity but getting it terribly wrong. Its limbs seemed too long, its head too small. But the worst part, the part that made my stomach twist, was the face. There were no eyes, no mouth, just an unbroken surface of smooth, pale skin. It was staring at me, waiting. The figure moved, slowly at first, then more quickly, like it was anticipating my reaction. It reached for the glass, its fingers stretching toward me, unnatural and thin. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to obey. The thing outside pressed its fingers against the glass, its pale skin touching the window with a sound that sent a chill down my spine. And then, with a soft, unsettling crack, the glass began to bend under its pressure, distorting like it was made of wax. The moonlight flickered in the glass, the figure's face warping and twisting, as though it was trying to break through. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. The room seemed to spin as I bolted toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, the door, once firmly shut, swung open on its own, revealing the darkness beyond. The shadows in the woods had come alive. They writhed, curling around trees like serpents, pulling themselves toward me. I had no choice but to run deeper into the woods. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I could feel the presence behind me, following, always just a step away. The footsteps weren't human anymore. The rustling was louder, more intense. The woods were no longer a place of nature. They were alive in a way that I couldn't comprehend. And the blood moon watched from above, its red light cutting through the trees like a blade. It was coming for me. My heart hammered in my chest as I ran, my legs moving on their own, the world around me a blur of black and red. The woods felt alive, the trees seeming to lean closer with each passing second, their branches like skeletal hands reaching for me. I could hear the rustling behind me, the sound of something chasing, something too fast, too relentless. The shadows on the ground twisted and stretched, warping in unnatural ways as if the very earth beneath me was shifting. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. The presence. Its weight pressing on my back, just a hair's breadth away. Each time I heard a snap of a twig or a rustle in the underbrush, my breath hitched, my body coiling in fear. But the creature didn't move like anything I had ever seen before. It wasn't like a person or an animal, it was something other, something ancient and hungry. A scream fought to escape my throat, but I swallowed it, forcing myself to breathe steadily. I had to stay calm. But the fear gnawed at me, eating away my rational thoughts. My mind was clouded, my thoughts scattered. Was I imagining it? Could it be just my mind playing tricks? The blood moon above me shimmered, casting its eerie glow through the gaps in the trees, painting everything in shades of crimson and shadow. I stumbled over a root, barely catching myself before hitting the ground. My knees burned from the impact, but there was no time to think about the pain. The creature was still out there, following me, its presence like a shadow at the edge of my vision. I pushed forward, the darkness closing in around me like a suffocating fog. Every step felt heavier than the last, the air thick and damp. The scent of decay was strong now, mingling with the fresh, earthy smell of the woods. But there was something else, something metallic. The tang of blood. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, the path I had been following now disappearing into a maze of tangled roots and brambles. My head spun as I tried to make sense of the landscape. The trees had closed in tighter, their trunks like towering monoliths, their branches twisting overhead like a living canopy. There was no way to tell where I was anymore. The rustling behind me grew louder, closer. I could feel it. Whatever was following me was gaining ground, its steps almost in sync with mine, like it was mimicking my every move. The very air felt thick with anticipation. It was playing with me, I realized. The thing wasn't trying to catch me, it was toying with me, savoring every second of my panic. I glanced over my shoulder, my breath coming in sharp gasps, and caught a fleeting glimpse of movement. Just a flash, but enough to send my pulse spiking. It was tall, too tall, and its shape was wrong, like a distorted reflection in a cracked mirror. The thing had no discernible form, just a series of shifting shapes, a blackness that swallowed the moonlight. I screamed, stumbling again as I pushed myself faster. The branches whipped at my face, the thorns tearing at my clothes. But I couldn't stop. If I stopped, it would catch me. If I looked back again, it would drag me into the darkness. I didn't know how much time had passed, how long I had been running, but my legs were burning with fatigue. My chest felt like it might explode, the air too thick to breathe properly. My thoughts were turning to mush, the fear overwhelming everything else. I finally broke through the trees, stumbling into a clearing. The moonlight hit me like a wave, casting long shadows across the ground. My eyes scanned the area desperately. There was a small cabin ahead, its outline barely visible through the haze of night. I didn't know if it was safe, but it was the only thing in sight. Without thinking, I sprinted toward it, my footsteps pounding against the earth. The sound of my pursuit had grown distant, but I could still feel the presence lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I reached the cabin, nearly throwing myself against the door, and found it unlocked. I pushed it open, slamming it shut behind me as quickly as I could. Inside, it was dark and cold. The air was stale, and the walls were lined with dust, but there was something oddly familiar about the place. It felt wrong, like it had been waiting for me. I backed into a corner, my breath shallow and rapid. The silence in the cabin was deafening, but I didn't dare let my guard down. My eyes darted to every corner, every shadow, but I couldn't see anything. I couldn't hear anything either. The presence had receded, but I knew it was still out there, waiting, watching. I sank to my knees, my body trembling from exhaustion and fear. My mind raced with questions. What was that thing? Why was it chasing me? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just a coincidence. There was something about me, something that had drawn this thing into my life. The blood moon wasn't just a sign, it was a summons. The door creaked behind me, and my heart stopped. I slowly turned around, but I didn't need to see to know what was there. I could feel it. It was in the air, thick and suffocating, wrapping around me like a vice. The door. It was moving. I watched in horror as the door cracked open, the shadows inside the cabin stretching, growing longer, thicker, reaching toward me. The creature was inside. It wasn't just outside anymore. I froze, my heart pounding in my throat as the door inched open. The dark shapes within the cabin seemed to shift, warping and stretching toward me like tendrils of some unseen force. I could feel the temperature in the room drop, my breath coming out in visible puffs as if the very air was turning to ice. The thing, whatever it was, had made its way inside. I could no longer deny it. The shadows it cast on the floor were wrong, too elongated, too alive. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence, a thing with intent, with hunger. A low growl vibrated through the walls, a sound so deep it seemed to come from the very earth beneath me. My body locked in place, a surge of panic flooding my system. Every instinct told me to run, but where? There was nowhere left to go. The cabin was small, its corners cramped and suffocating, and the door had already begun to close behind it. I turned toward the only window, but the moonlight outside had changed. Its soft glow had deepened to a dark crimson, like blood spilled across the sky. I knew then, with a sickening certainty, that I wasn't just running from something. I had walked into its domain. The moon, the shadows, the creature, it was all part of something older than time itself. The presence behind me grew heavier, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I wanted to scream, but the air seemed to constrict around my throat. I tried to move, but my legs refused to obey. All I could do was watch as the shadows stretched further, inching closer until they merged with the edges of the room. It was coming. I could hear it then. The soft rustling of movement, a slow, deliberate scraping sound like claws against wood. My skin crawled as the darkness seemed to press in from every angle, and then it appeared. At first, it was just a figure in the dark, a shape too twisted to be human, too large to be anything normal. But as it stepped fully into the room, the light from the blood moon outside seemed to distort around it, the room warping in ways I couldn't comprehend. Its body shifted and changed, its form flickering, like a mirage, almost human but not. Long limbs twisted at unnatural angles, and its face, if you could even call it that, was a blurred mess of features, no eyes, no mouth, just an endless swirl of dark energy. It didn't move like anything living. It glided, drifting toward me, its presence smothering the room with a palpable heaviness. I could feel the temperature dropping further, the air growing thick with a terrible pressure. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but my legs were frozen, my body refusing to respond. And then the whispers started. At first, they were barely audible, a soft, hissing sound like wind through dead leaves. But as the thing drew closer, the whispers grew louder, clearer. They were words, they were feelings. Emotions that ripped at my sanity, fear, anger, despair. Each whisper felt like a sharp jab to my mind, leaving a raw, bleeding wound in its wake. "You cannot escape," it whispered. The voice wasn't human, yet it felt as if it was directly inside my skull, crawling through my thoughts, wrapping around them. "You never could." A cold laugh, not unlike the rustling of dry paper, echoed from somewhere inside the thing. I couldn't understand why, but it seemed to enjoy my terror. The thing wasn't just here for me. It was here for my fear. With every step it took, the room seemed to shrink, the shadows deepening, suffocating me. The weight in the air grew unbearable. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and I felt my knees buckle beneath me. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to move. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I pushed myself off the floor, my body still heavy with dread, but I forced myself to run. There was no plan, no direction, just escape. I bolted for the back door, praying it wasn't locked, my hand trembling as I fumbled for the handle. It wasn't locked. I yanked it open with a force I didn't know I had, stumbling into the night air. The moon hung high in the sky, a red and swollen orb that cast a sickly glow over everything. The night around me had grown quieter, but the silence felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. I didn't dare look back, even though I could feel it, the thing's presence following me like a shadow. I heard it, the scraping sound, growing fainter, but never gone. My thoughts raced. Where could I go? What could I do? I had to get to safety. I had to find something to stop it. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. I couldn't stay here. But every instinct screamed at me to run deeper into the woods, away from the cabin, away from the blood moon that seemed to mock me from above. As I sprinted toward the trees, my thoughts blurred with terror and confusion. The thing wasn't just chasing me. It had been waiting for me, calling me. The whispers hadn't been random, they had been a warning, a curse, and I had unwittingly walked straight into it. Somewhere, deep in the heart of the forest, there had to be an answer. Maybe, just maybe, if I could find it, I could escape this nightmare. But there was no guarantee. And the blood moon's light, its cold, mocking light, made it clear that I wasn't the hunter in this chase. I was the prey. And it was getting closer. The forest swallowed me whole, its dense thicket closing in like the jaws of some ancient beast. The trees, black silhouettes in the crimson moonlight, seemed to lean closer with every step, their branches reaching toward me with an almost predatory intent. The ground beneath me was soft, uneven, and my feet sank with every hurried stride. My breath was ragged, burning in my lungs as I pushed myself to move faster, even though my body screamed in exhaustion. I could still hear it, the scraping sound, faint but persistent, like nails on stone. It was a sound I could no longer ignore, no matter how hard I tried to push it from my mind. The creature was out there, somewhere in the shadows, its presence looming over me like an inescapable cloud of dread. Every step I took, I felt its weight grow heavier, its darkness creeping closer. But where was it? Why hadn't it caught up yet? I couldn't decide whether that thought gave me hope or twisted the knife deeper into my gut. It had followed me this far. Was it toying with me, or was it waiting for me to make a mistake? I stumbled over another root, falling to my knees in the dirt. My hands scraped the ground, my fingers trembling with the force of the impact. My vision blurred for a moment as I blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the dizziness. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the trees themselves were closing in on me, trapping me in their gnarled embrace. I knew I couldn't stop moving, but my body was failing me. The exhaustion, the fear, the realization that there was nowhere left to run, it all weighed on me, crushing me. And then, there it was. A soft rustle in the bushes to my right, too close. It wasn't just the wind this time. This sound was deliberate, measured. I whipped my head toward it, my pulse spiking as a chill crawled up my spine. The forest seemed to hold its breath as I waited, my body tense and quilled like a spring ready to snap. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. A shadow darted between the trees, too fast for me to track, too fluid to be real. My blood ran cold. The creature had found me. Without thinking, I scrambled to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every breath I took felt like it was choking me. I wasn't even sure which direction I was running in anymore. The forest was a labyrinth, its pathways twisting and turning, leading me deeper into its heart. And yet, I couldn't stop running. The rustling behind me grew louder, more frantic. I could hear it now, low, guttural breathing, coming from the shadows, closer with every passing second. It was gaining on me. And then, a voice. A whisper, so soft, so insidious, that I couldn't tell if it was in my head or if it was real. You cannot outrun what you are. The words slithered into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts like a suffocating vine. The voice was inside me now. It knew my every fear, my every weakness. I tried to push it out, to ignore it, but it was impossible. The thing was toying with me, just like before. It was no longer just chasing me, it was playing with my mind, unraveling me piece by piece. My legs buckled under me again, and I fell, my hands scraping against the earth, my face pressing into the damp soil. I had to get up. I had to keep going. But as I pushed myself up, I saw it, standing at the edge of the clearing, bathed in the blood-red light of the moon. The creature was no longer a shadow, no longer a wisp of darkness. It had taken form, its features twisted and grotesque. It was impossibly tall, its limbs stretching far beyond what was natural, its body covered in a shifting cloak of shadows. Its face was the worst part. There were no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless surface, pale and cold as marble, with cracks running through it, like the surface of a broken statue. The air around it shimmered, as though the very fabric of reality was warping. I could feel the gravity of it pulling at me, a crushing force that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. "You can't hide from me," the voice came again, this time louder, closer, like it was right next to my ear. "You were already mine." I tried to move, tried to run, but my legs were like lead. My body was betraying me, weighed down by the creature's presence, by the crushing weight of the blood moon overhead. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, to move in strange, unpredictable ways. The trees twisted and groaned, their limbs contorting, closing in like a cage. And then I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the reach of the creature's influence, there was a faint glow. A light, flickering in the dark, a beacon. It was weak, but it was there. It was my only hope. I don't know what made me do it, whether it was sheer desperation or the last remnants of my will to survive. But I ran. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed myself toward that light, my feet pounding against the earth, the creature's presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't stop. I couldn't think. I just ran. And then, as I reached the light, it suddenly blazed brighter, filling the clearing with a harsh, blinding radiance. The air crackled, and the creature let out a horrible, screeching sound, like metal scraping against stone. I couldn't see anything for a moment, the light blinding me, overwhelming me. When the light faded, the creature was gone. The forest was silent. The oppressive air had lifted. And yet, something felt wrong. Too wrong. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, my body trembling, my mind on the edge of collapse. I had escaped, but at what cost? The blood moon hung in the sky, its red glow casting a sickly hue across the world. But there was no peace, no relief. Because even though I was still alive, I knew it wasn't over. The creature was still out there, waiting, and it would never stop hunting me. I remember the moment I first noticed it, though I didn't understand it at the time. It was just a small thing, something almost unnoticeable. The world around me didn't seem quite as bright anymore. The colors had begun to dull, like someone had turned the contrast down on reality itself. At first, I thought it was just the exhaustion from my work, the sleepless nights stacking up like the broken pieces of a crumbling clock. But the more I looked, the more it became clear something was wrong. The world felt off. The trees outside my window, usually so vibrant in their green, now stood like silent sentinels, lifeless, their once radiant leaves now faded to a dull, ashen hue. The sky above them, which should have been a clear blue, was smeared with gray, as though the heavens themselves had been washed of their color. I stood by the window, staring at the landscape, trying to put my finger on the growing discomfort crawling under my skin. It wasn't just the colors. It was the sounds, or more accurately, the lack of them. The chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the hum of distant traffic, everything that had once filled the air with life now felt distant, muffled, like I was submerged underwater. It was as if the world had shifted just slightly out of sync with what I knew, like an old film reel that had become misaligned. But it wasn't just the outside world that had changed. Inside my apartment, everything felt colder. The air, once warm and inviting, was now filled with a strange, biting chill that seemed to crawl under my skin and settle in my bones. The silence in the room was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Even the ticking of the clock on the wall, something I'd never noticed before, seemed louder, more insistent, as if it was counting down to something inevitable. I walked into the kitchen, hoping to distract myself with a cup of coffee, but the moment I entered, the smell hit me, stale, sour, almost metallic. It wasn't the kind of scent that belonged in my apartment. I'd never smelled it before, and it sent a wave of nausea through me. I paused, my hand frozen over the mug. The air in the room thickened, the walls seeming to press closer together, and I had the sudden, overwhelming urge to leave, to get out of there before whatever this was consumed me whole. But I couldn't move. A low hum, almost imperceptible, vibrated through the floor beneath me. It wasn't a sound I could hear, but I could feel it deep in my chest, a pulse that didn't belong to anything natural. It was as though the earth itself was shifting, groaning under some unseen weight. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. As I reached for the door, a chill ran up my spine. There was no wind. There was no reason for the temperature to drop like that. The room felt oppressive, the walls closing in with every breath I took. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was all just a result of stress. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had changed. Something had broken. The moment I stepped outside, the world hit me like a wave. The streets, once bustling with life, were eerily silent. There were no sounds of cars passing, no chatter of pedestrians, no hum of distant machines. It was as though the world had been wiped clean, leaving behind a haunting emptiness. The buildings around me, usually so familiar, now looked alien, their sharp lines and stark angles casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. The sun, what was left of it, was pale, weak, and dim, its light failing to pierce the growing dusk that seemed to settle over the city. I didn't know why, but I felt the pull of the alleyway to my left. It was dark, too dark for this time of day, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me there. I tried to ignore it, but the pull grew stronger, like an invisible force was drawing me closer. I stepped forward, each movement feeling heavier than the last, my body fighting against the urge to turn back. As I reached the entrance of the alley, a faint whisper reached my ears, so quiet I could barely distinguish the words. But I knew they weren't meant for me. They were meant for someone else, someone who had walked this path long before me. I glanced over my shoulder, but the street was still empty, as if everyone had vanished in an instant. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, acrid scent, like burnt metal, like something had been consumed, reduced to nothing. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that I wasn't alone. Not here. Not anymore. The alley was dark, but I had to go forward. There was nowhere else to go. And as I took that first step into the shadows, I felt it, the world shifting again, like a piece of reality being peeled back, revealing something darker underneath. The silence grew louder. And then, as I moved deeper into the alley, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I wasn't alone. But the question was, what was following me? And in that moment, I knew the world had changed. There was no going back. Only forward, deeper into the cursed world that awaited me. I felt the air grow colder still, as the sound of the footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I quickened my pace, my shoes slapping against the cracked pavement. Each step felt like it weighed 100 pounds, each echoed too loud in the eerie silence of the alley. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear anything else. But those footsteps, they were still there, growing closer with every second. I glanced over my shoulder again. The alley behind me was empty, just shadows in the fading light of the pale sun. There was nothing but the overwhelming sensation of being watched. The cold air pressed down on me, as though the very atmosphere had become thick, suffocating. But there was no one there. The world outside of this narrow alley seemed miles away, its noise and life lost to this strange, oppressive silence. The footsteps didn't stop. It was impossible. My mind screamed that there was no one following me, that it was just my imagination running wild. But the sound was undeniable. A soft scrape against the ground, followed by a slow, deliberate step. It was too real to ignore. I turned a corner, hoping to lose whatever, or whoever it was, but the steps followed. They followed like a shadow that refused to leave. They weren't hurried, but they weren't far behind either. I could hear the scrape of a shoe on stone. The noise was coming from right behind me. I looked back again. The alley had twisted. It didn't make sense, but somehow the path I was walking on now wasn't the same one I had entered. The walls had closed in, narrowing, their once familiar graffiti now warped and contorted into unnatural shapes. The streetlights overhead flickered, casting strange shadows that danced like living things reaching toward me. I started to run. It wasn't a decision, it wasn't a thought, it was instinct. My legs carried me forward faster than I had ever moved in my life, but the footsteps didn't slow. If anything, they sped up. A part of me screamed to look back, to see if there was someone there, but I refused. If I turned around, I was certain I'd see something that I couldn't escape from. It wasn't a person. It wasn't human. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me, coming in quick, visible bursts. The alley stretched on, its end hidden in an impenetrable darkness. I tried to turn another corner, to find an exit, but the layout of the alley kept shifting. It was no longer a straight path. It had turned into a maze, a labyrinth, the walls seemingly closing in from all sides. I could feel the weight of the world pressing in around me, and I knew that every corner I turned brought me deeper into whatever nightmare I had walked into. I could feel the presence behind me, though I dared not look. The footsteps weren't following me anymore. They had become my steps, matching my pace perfectly, a dark, mirroring presence that reflected my every movement. My heart pounded in my chest, my head spinning, and my legs were starting to give out from the panic and exhaustion. But still, the footsteps never faltered, never slowed. I had to get out. I had to. I slammed into something. It wasn't a wall. It wasn't a barrier. It was cold, like a frozen sheet of glass or metal, but solid, impenetrable. I stumbled back, gasping for air, but when I reached out again, I realized something terrifying. There was no way out. I was trapped. I turned in every direction, but the walls of the alley had grown even taller, the sky above replaced by nothing but darkness. There were no windows, no doors, no openings to the outside world. My breathing was erratic, my pulse pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. I pressed my back against the cold surface, trying to steady myself, but I could feel it. Something was watching me from the shadows, something that didn't belong. My mind raced, but it couldn't catch up with the reality around me. I had no plan. There was no way out. The alley, the walls, the darkness, everything felt like it was suffocating me. I was losing my grip on what was real. I closed my eyes, willing myself to calm down, to think logically. There had to be a way out. There had to be something I was missing. I ran my hands over the smooth, cold surface behind me. The metal or glass, whatever it was unnaturally cold, like it had been frozen from the inside. But as my hands slid along the surface, I felt something sharp. A jagged edge, a crack. My heart skipped a beat. I pressed harder, my fingers trembling as I traced the crack, my breath catching in my throat. The crack widened, the chills spraying across my palm. It was like the alley itself was breaking, like it was starting to crack open. I pulled harder, my nails scraping against the edge. I felt the air shift, like something was about to emerge from the other side. And then, with a final, desperate push, the surface gave way. A bright, white light flooded through the crack, blinding me for a moment. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes, but when the light receded, I saw it. A door. It was there, in front of me, where there had been nothing before. It was old, with rusted hinges and a handle that seemed to be made of twisted metal. But it was a door, and it was my only chance. I didn't think. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open, stepping through without a second thought. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt the world shift again, violently this time. The alley behind me was gone. The walls, the shadows, the footsteps, they were all gone. But the air still felt thick, the silence still suffocating. And somewhere, in the distance, I heard a voice, a whisper, too faint to make out, but undeniably there. I wasn't safe. Not yet. Whatever I had just escaped, whatever followed me, was still out there. And it would find me again. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, but the air felt wrong. The very atmosphere seemed to pulse with unease, as if the world around me was holding its breath. The door behind me slammed shut with a resounding crash, and I flinched, the sound echoing in the now empty space. I stood in a room that should have been familiar, yet everything about it felt off. It was a hallway, like the ones I'd seen in countless old buildings, a narrow, dimly lit corridor with peeling wallpaper and a stale scent of dust. But the walls seemed to close in on me. They were darker than they should have been, their once soft shades of beige now stained with patches of black, as though the walls themselves were decaying. The lights overhead flickered, casting eerie shadows that stretched across the floor, reaching for me like fingers. I turned around, expecting to see the door, but there was nothing. Just an endless stretch of hallway that seemed to extend further than it should. The walls curved slightly, the corners too soft to be real. The floor beneath my feet creaked with every step, and each noise seemed to echo too loudly in the heavy silence. I had to keep moving. I had no choice. The shadows at the far end of the hall tugged at the edges of my mind, pulling me forward. My skin prickled, goosebumps rising as I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew that something was wrong, so wrong, and it was alive. The faint whisper I had heard earlier grew louder now, but it was still unintelligible. It was like a soft murmur, a voice too distant to reach, but it was there. In the corners of my mind. In the very walls themselves. I walked forward cautiously, each step feeling like an eternity, but the further I went, the more distorted the hall seemed to become. The wallpaper peeled back in places, revealing rotting wood underneath, and the air grew colder, thick with a sense of dread. I tried to push the fear down, but it clawed at me, growing stronger with every moment. Then I noticed something in the corner of my eye. A shadow. It wasn't right. It didn't match the flickering light from the overhead bulbs. It shifted unnaturally, moving with a jerky, disjointed motion, like something trying to escape from the corner of the room. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't tell if it was just a trick of the light or if something was actually there. The whispering intensified. I turned my head slowly, afraid to move too quickly. But when I looked, the shadow was gone. Vanished. Just like that. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. But the air still felt wrong. My pulse quickened as I continued down the hallway, but now I could hear something else, soft, deliberate footsteps echoing from the same place the shadow had disappeared. I wasn't alone. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever, or whatever, was following me had found me again. I glanced over my shoulder, my breath catching in my throat. It was a figure. The hallway distorted further, the walls twisting like wet paper. The figure at the end of the hall was moving toward me, but it wasn't walking. It was floating. Drifting closer, its body unnaturally bent in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The thing that hovered in front of me was covered in ragged, tattered clothing, its form too blurred to make out in detail. But its face, it had no face. There was only a featureless expanse of pale skin where its face should have been. No eyes. No mouth. Just a smooth, empty surface. But somehow, I could feel it staring at me. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something sharp and jagged on the floor. I gasped, barely catching myself against the wall. My pulse raced as the figure continued to approach. I turned and ran, instinct overriding all rational thought. The hallway seemed endless now, its twists and turns blending into a maze that I couldn't escape from. Every step I took only made the figure closer, its slow, floating movement inescapable. I could hear it now, a scraping noise, like bone dragging across the floor, each step dragging the weight of an eternity. I reached for the door, but there was nothing. The hallway stretched on, and I was trapped. The walls pressed in around me, closing in tighter with each breath I took. The figure was almost upon me. I stumbled forward, panic overtaking me, but then, suddenly, a door appeared, just like before. It was a solid, wooden door with a rusty handle. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the handle and yanked the door open with all the strength I had left. I stumbled into what looked like a living room, a small, dimly lit space with worn furniture. The air inside felt warmer, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I allowed myself to breathe. But then, the door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the whisper again. Louder. Clearer. You're not safe. I spun around, looking for the source, but there was no one. The room felt alive. The furniture seemed to shift, the chairs rearranging themselves in strange, unsettling patterns. The walls creaked and groaned as though something was moving within them. The whisper came again, now accompanied by a low, guttural hum that filled the room, vibrating through my chest. You're never safe. I backed into a corner, my mind racing. I had no idea where I was, or how I had gotten here, but I knew one thing for sure. This was no longer just a bad dream. This place, whatever it was, had a life of its own. And it was hungry. The shadows in the room began to stretch, growing longer and darker. They moved of their own accord, slithering like tendrils across the floor, the walls, even the ceiling. They were reaching for me. And I knew, deep down, that the thing with no face was still out there. It hadn't given up. It was still hunting me. I didn't know how much longer I could survive in this cursed world. The room began to spin. My vision blurred as I fought to steady myself, pressing my hand against the cold wall to keep from collapsing. The whispering was now more than just a voice. It was a presence, crawling into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts like a vice. "You're not real." The voice was clear, and it came from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the air itself. None of this is real. I shook my head violently, trying to silence the voice, trying to make sense of what was happening. I had to focus. I had to find a way out. But every step I took only seemed to lead me deeper into this nightmare. I turned in a circle, my breath ragged in my chest. The shadows were closing in, stretching like fingers toward my feet. I could hear them moving, whispering amongst themselves, the very fabric of the room seeming to bend under their weight. It was like the room was alive, and it was trying to swallow me whole. I stumbled back toward the door, the one I had come through just moments ago. But when I reached for the handle, my fingers passed through it, as if the door had become a part of the wall itself. I pulled back, horrified, and glanced around. The room was twisting. The walls shifted, folding in on themselves like a paper being crumpled, the floor buckling beneath my feet. The furniture melted into one another, their shapes contorting and blurring. Nothing looked the way it had just moments before. I felt as though I was standing in a dream, a distorted, nightmarish version of reality. The air grew thick, stifling, like trying to breathe underwater. My chest tightened, and I fought to hold on to some semblance of clarity. But there was no clarity here. There was nothing. The shadows advanced, swirling in the corners of the room, pooling together like ink spilled in water. They twisted into shapes, shifting and reforming with each passing second. And then, I saw it again, the thing. The figure with no face. It hovered in the center of the room, floating in the thickening darkness. The air grew colder, the room seeming to lose all warmth, all life. I could feel the weight of its presence, pressing down on me, suffocating me. It moved toward me, its limbs jerking unnaturally, its body contorting with every step. It didn't walk, it glided, as though it were tethered to some other, unseen force. The absence of its face seemed to draw my eyes in, as though my mind couldn't comprehend the void where its features should have been. It was getting closer. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, but the room seemed to stretch endlessly. No matter how far I moved, the figure followed. It was always there, hovering just beyond my reach. The shadows swarmed around me, clinging to my skin, to my clothes, as though they wanted to pull me into the depths of whatever twisted reality this place was. I turned again, desperate, looking for some escape. And then I saw it, the window. It wasn't much, but it was a way out. A sliver of hope in the madness. I rushed toward it, my hands trembling as I yanked open the window with all my strength. The air outside was thick with fog, a blanket of mist that obscured everything beyond the glass. It looked wrong. The fog swirled and moved in strange patterns, like it had a life of its own. I could barely see beyond the edge of the frame, but I knew one thing for sure: there was no safety beyond the glass. A sharp click echoed in the room, and I spun around to see the figure now directly behind me, its presence almost suffocating. The whispers grew louder, now indistinguishable from the pounding of my own heart. "You cannot escape." I felt its presence pressing against my back, felt it moving through me, its coldness seeping into my bones. My entire body went rigid as I turned to face it. It didn't have a face. It didn't need one. Its featureless expanse of skin warped, rippling like water disturbed by unseen forces. A sound, soft at first, began to come from the space where its mouth should have been. A low, growling like something feral, something hungry. I couldn't breathe. It was too much. Too much to comprehend. My mind was breaking under the weight of it all. The whispers, the shadows, the relentless pressure of the thing behind me. I couldn't fight it. There was no fighting it. The room bent further, the walls and the floor twisting together into a horrifying spiral. My surroundings shattered, as if reality itself had been cracked open, and all the pieces of the world I knew had started to fall away. And then the figure moved closer, its ragged, inhuman limbs reaching for me, the dark void of its face swallowing everything in its path. I couldn't escape. There was nowhere left to run. The shadows had claimed every corner of the room. "You're not real," it whispered again, its voice like sandpaper scraping across my mind. And just like that, everything went dark. The whispers stopped. The room faded. The last thing I heard before everything dissolved was the haunting sound of my own heartbeat echoing in the vast emptiness. But when I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the same place anymore. The room was gone. The walls were gone. The floor beneath me was gone. It was as if the world had simply reset. I was standing in a vast, endless void. And once again, I heard the whisper, "You're not real." I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain: this world wasn't mine anymore. The rules had changed. I was trapped in a broken reality, and there was no escape. I couldn't tell where I was anymore. The void stretched endlessly in every direction, a thick, oppressive darkness that swallowed up any sense of reality. The air was stale, heavy, suffocating. My body felt numb, my limbs sluggish, as if I were submerged in something thick and viscous. The whispering had stopped, but I could feel it, a low hum, like the earth itself was trembling beneath me, a pulse that vibrated in my bones. I wanted to scream, but the words got stuck in my throat. My mouth felt dry, like I hadn't spoken in years. I opened my eyes wider, trying to focus, trying to find something, anything, that might explain where I was, what was happening. But there was nothing. Just the emptiness, endless and suffocating. Then, out of the darkness, a shape began to form. At first, it was only a faint distortion in the air, a ripple in the fabric of the void. But as I focused on it, the shape grew clearer. It was a figure, tall, hunched, its outline shifting like a shadow on the edge of my vision. The figure seemed to pulse, as if it was breathing, its every movement leaving ripples in the space around it. And then it spoke. "You still don't understand." The voice was guttural, distant, yet it reverberated inside my skull, rattling my mind with its weight. The words felt like they were inside me, crawling under my skin. "What do you mean? What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. It sounded strange, as if I were hearing it from a distance, detached from my own body. The figure moved closer, its form becoming more defined with every step it took. Its limbs were impossibly long, thin and twisted like branches on a tree that had been bent by a storm. The edges of its body blurred, as though it was made of darkness itself, its shape constantly flickering in and out of focus. "This is the world you created," it said, its voice seeping into my thoughts like poison. "This is the world that you built with your fear, your doubts, your inability to face the truth." I staggered backward, my heart pounding in my chest. "No." I didn't create this. This isn't me. The figure tilted its head, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was trying to understand me. Oh, but it is. Everything here, every shadow, every whisper, every broken piece of reality, it's all a reflection of your mind. Your fractured soul. I shook my head, trying to block out the voice, but it only grew louder, the words crawling through my thoughts, picking apart my mind piece by piece. You were never meant to see the truth, it continued. But now you have. Now you see what's been hiding beneath the surface all along. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the voice slipped through, finding its way into my very being. This world is a prison, the figure whispered, its face finally coming into focus. It was featureless, just a void, nothing but darkness, like looking into an empty abyss. But somehow, I could feel it staring into me, digging through my mind. A prison that you built for yourself. The voice was soft now, almost pitying. You created this place to hide from the truth. But there is no escaping. No way out. Terror seized me, my breath quickening as the world seemed to close in on me. No, I don't understand. What truth? What do you mean? The figure stretched out a hand, and the very air seemed to warp around it. It wasn't a hand anymore, it was a tendril of darkness, reaching toward me, toward my very soul. The truth is that nothing here is real. The tendril touched my chest, and I felt a sharp, searing pain as though it was burning through my skin, sinking into my heart. This world, your life, everything you thought you knew, it's all a lie. A reflection of the fear you refused to face. I screamed, the pain ripping through me, but the scream was swallowed by the void. There was no sound here, no escape. Only the darkness, and the figure, and the whispers that clawed at my mind. The world began to warp around me again. The figure was dissolving, breaking apart, fading into the blackness. Its voice was the last thing I heard, its words lingering in the air like a curse. You will never escape yourself. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, but there was no air to breathe. The emptiness closed in around me, tightening, squeezing the life out of me. I felt my mind unraveling, like threads of reality were slipping through my fingers. There was no way out. There was no escape. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was back. The world was still. The walls, the floor, the familiar objects scattered around me. It looked the same. It felt the same. But something was off. The colors were duller now, the sounds farther away, as if the world itself had shifted just slightly out of focus. I could still feel the weight of the void pressing down on me, could still hear the echoes of the figure's voice inside my mind. I wasn't sure if I was awake anymore. And as I looked around, I realized maybe I never had been. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to move, stretching, pulling, whispering. And I knew, deep down, that I was still trapped in the broken reality. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.